Right now, somewhere in northern Arizona, there are people who will tell you this is not the first world, not the second, not even the third. This is the fourth world humans have ever lived in. And according to the Hopi, the other three didn't just fade away quietly. They ended, violently, completely, wiped clean like a chalkboard, with only a handful of people slipping through each time to start over. Think about that for a second. A living tradition, carried forward for generations, insisting that humanity has already died out 3 separate times before this one. Not metaphorically, not as a bedtime story with a moral tacked on the end, as a real account of what happened, passed down through ceremony, through clan memory, through elders who were taught by elders who were taught by elders, going back further than most written history on Earth even reaches. And each time, according to the story, something ended it. Fire consumed the first world. Ice froze the second into stillness. Water rose up and swallowed the third whole. 3 different catastrophes, 3 different elements, 3 different endings. And each time a small group of people found a way through, a narrow passage, an opening, a portal into the next world up. Sound familiar? It should, because global flood stories, world-ending fire, sudden catastrophic cold, these show up again and again across cultures that had zero contact with each other. That alone should make you sit up a little straighter. Now, before we go further, I want to be upfront with you. This isn't going to be me telling you the Hopi predicted plate tectonics or secretly encoded Ice Age data in their oral history. This is more careful than that. We're going to walk through what the Hopi traditions actually say in their own structure and their own logic, and then we're going to look at what geologists, archaeologists, and climate scientists have found about Earth's actual deep past. Sometimes those 2 threads line up in ways that are genuinely eerie. Sometimes they don't line up at all, and I'll tell you that too. No pretending we know more than we do. If you're listening to this late at night, drifting off somewhere between waking and sleep, let me know where you are and what time it is right now. I read every comment, and it's wild scrolling through and seeing London at 2 a.m. Manila at lunch, Toronto right before sunrise, all listening to the same story about the end of the world at completely different moments in their own day. And if this kind of long, slow burn storytelling is something you want, without ads interrupting every few minutes, follow the podcast on Spotify. It's free, it supports the channel more than you'd think, and the link is sitting right there in the description. A 5-star review helps too, more than the algorithm will ever admit. Okay, 3 lost worlds, fire, ice, flood, are people who say they remember all of it. So, what actually ended those worlds according to the ones who kept the story alive? And is there any chance at all, that something real is buried underneath the telling? To answer that, we first need to understand who the Hopi actually are, and why calling this a myth might be the first mistake most people make. So who are we actually talking about here? The Hopi are a Native American nation living today on 3 mesas in northeastern Arizona, high desert plateaus rising out of the landscape like stone islands, surrounded by the Navajo Nation on almost every side. First mesa, second mesa, third mesa. Villages like Oribe, which archaeologists believe has been continuously inhabited since at least the 1100 SNETs, making it one of the oldest continuously occupied settlements in what is now the United States. Not a ruin, not a reconstruction, not a place where people used to live before getting moved onto a reservation. People live there right now, today, this year, farming corn in impossibly dry soil using techniques passed down for centuries, holding ceremonies on the same calendar their ancestors held them on, speaking a language that connects directly back through generation after generation without a hard break. That distinction matters more than it might seem at first. When we talk about the Hopi and their account of 3 previous worlds, We are not talking about something dug out of a dead civilization by archaeologists piecing together fragments. We're talking about a living oral tradition, still being carried by living people, still connected to living ceremony, still taught by living elders to living children. That changes the entire ethical shape of this conversation. This isn't Atlantis. Nobody's grandmother is alive to correct your version of Atlantis. Hopi grandmothers are very much alive to correct your version of this. And that brings up something we need to sit with, honestly, before going any further. A significant portion of Hopi religious and cosmological knowledge is not meant for outsiders. Not because it's being hidden out of secrecy for secrecy's sake, but because in Hopi understanding, certain knowledge is tied to ceremonial responsibility, to clan roles, to ritual timing, to a whole framework of who is allowed to hold and transmit which pieces of the story and when. Some of what gets told to the public is a simplified version, a version safe for outside ears. Some of the deeper layers stay inside Kiva walls, inside initiated circles, inside relationships built over years of trust. We are not going to pretend we have access to that deeper layer. We don't. Almost nobody outside the Hopi does. So here's how we're going to handle this carefully. What follows in this video draws from public statements made by Hopi elders and cultural leaders themselves, people who have chosen deliberately to share certain parts of this tradition with the wider world, usually because they believe the world needs to hear the warning inside it. It also draws from decades of ethnographic work, anthropologists like Frank Waters, Harold Corlander and Alfred Whiting, who spent years building relationships with Hopi communities and recording versions of these narratives with permission. Even then, we're going to paraphrase carefully, rather than presenting anything as the single authoritative version, because there isn't one single authoritative version. Different clans hold different pieces, different villages emphasize different details. That's not a flaw in the tradition. That's how oral tradition is supposed to work, alive, flexible, distributed across many keepers, instead of locked into one printed page. Now, I also want to draw a hard line between actual Hopi tradition and what you'll find scattered across parts of the internet claiming to be Hopi prophecy. A lot of that material is pan-Indian blending, ideas borrowed loosely from a dozen different native nations, mashed together into something that sounds ancient and mystical but was never actually taught in any specific Hopi Kiva. Some of it is outright invention, New Age reinterpretation dressed up in feathers and turquoise for aesthetic effect. Hopi cultural leaders themselves have pushed back publicly against this, sometimes sharply pointing out that quotes get twisted, prophecies get exaggerated, and entire frameworks get slapped with a Hopi label that Hopi people never actually said. So, when specific claims show up later in this video, we'll try to be upfront about where they're coming from and how solid that sourcing actually is. Here's the frame I want you holding on to as we move forward. These accounts of the first, second, and third worlds were never meant to be entertainment. They weren't campfire stories designed to give kids a fright before bed. In Hopi tradition, this narrative functions as instruction, a moral and practical guide for how to live in a way that doesn't repeat the mistakes that ended the worlds before this one. It's less like a myth and more like a warning label that's been rewritten and repeated for possibly thousands of years because the warning still applies. Treat it that way, and something interesting starts to happen. The story stops being a curiosity about ancient people and starts feeling uncomfortably relevant to right now. So let's step into it properly, not as tourists gawking at an old legend, but as people willing to actually listen to what's being taught. When Hopi elders talk about worlds, they're not just talking about different planets or some sci-fi multiverse. A world in this context is a whole pattern of life, a complete arrangement of relationships between humans, other beings, the land, and what we might call the sacred order of things. Each world has its own way of being, its own balance point. and when that balance is pushed too far, for too long, the world ends. Then another begins. So right from the start, this is a cyclical thinking system. Time isn't just a straight line rolling from creation to apocalypse. It's more like seasons or agricultural cycles or the way forests burn and regrow. Worlds arise, mature, drift out of balance, and are brought to an end so that something new, hopefully wiser, can emerge. Creation and destruction aren't opposites, they're phases of the same process. And crucially, the causes of those endings are not just mechanical. They're not random bolts of lightning from a careless universe. They're moral, ecological, ethical, and environmental at the same time. In the Hopi telling, the world doesn't burn or freeze or flood purely because some god gets angry and pushes a button. It ends because living beings, especially humans, stop carrying their responsibilities. They forget agreements. They mistreat the land. They treat each other as objects instead of relatives. They abandon the instructions they were given for how to live in a balanced way. Natural forces are the way those broken relationships cash out. If you push the ecosystem hard enough, you get drought, crop failure, famine. If you unravel social obligations, you get violence, domination, slavery. If you ignore spiritual obligations, you get beings and forces that no longer cooperate with you. In Hopi thought, none of those can really be separated. They're all part of one fabric. When that fabric frays past a certain point, the world that depends on it can't continue in the same form. That's what makes these origin narratives instructional rather than just explanatory. They're not trying to answer, in a vacuum, how did everything begin? They're trying to answer, very pointedly, what happens when we live the wrong way? What happens when we forget? The disasters are the last chapter. The real story is about the slow drift that leads there. Now, that doesn't mean there's only one official script everyone follows. Hopi origin narratives exist as a web of related tellings, not a single canon text. Different clans hold different segments of the narrative. One clan might carry more detail about emergence from a previous world. Another might carry specific migration accounts. Another might emphasize the role of a particular spiritual helper or ceremonial obligation. Ceremony is where those pieces are activated. When a story is told in a kiva during a specific ritual, it isn't just information. It's part of doing something in the world, aligning with seasons, renewing a relationship, correcting a course. Some versions of the world's stories are only told at certain times, or only by certain elders, or only to people who have taken on particular responsibilities. You don't just casually announce, here's the Hopi story of the worlds, the way you might read a fairy tale out loud. Context matters. Audience matters. Intention matters. That's also why you'll see variation in the public record. Anthropologists working with Hopi consultants in one village might record a version where the emphasis is on human arrogance and forgetting their creator. Another village's account might put more weight on sexual misconduct, or sorcery, or abuse of power. The pattern is the same, imbalance leading to cleansing, but the specific emphasis shifts depending on who is telling it, to whom, and for what purpose. From the outside, this can look like inconsistency. From the inside, it's more like different verses of the same song, sung by different voices. No single verse is the whole thing, but together they give you a sense of the melody. To make sense of all this, we also have to talk about how to read these stories. Literally, allegorically, symbolically, many Hopi people today will tell you straightforwardly that these worlds are real, that there really were previous phases of existence, previous destructions, previous emergences, that the migrations across the southwest, the footprints left in petroglyphs, the shrines and springs and place names are not metaphors. They're traces of actual journeys and covenants. At the same time, those very real journeys are almost always told in a way that is layered with symbol. Fire is not just fire. Water is not just water. You can hear a world-ending flood story and understand it as a memory of some ancient deluge, and also understand it as a commentary on what happens when greed and excess overflow their banks. Those readings aren't in competition. They sit on top of each other. From a Hopi perspective, a story that is only literal is weak, and a story that is only metaphorical, cut off from lived history and land, is also weak. The power sits in the overlap, where physical events, moral lessons, and spiritual relationships are all being talked about at once. So as we go forward, we're going to be walking a narrow ridge. We'll talk about fire, ice, and flood as they appear in Hopi accounts, and sometimes we'll ask whether those might echo real geological or climatic events. But we'll also keep an eye on what those elements mean inside the tradition itself. What they say about human behaviour, obligation, and the consequences of ignoring either. Which brings us to the core question that runs underneath every version of the Hopi world narrative. What exactly triggers a world to change? Not in the sense of an asteroid hits or a fault line slips, but in the sense of what behaviours, what attitudes, what patterns of relationship make it impossible for a given way of life to continue? When do you cross the line from we're in trouble to this world can't be sustained in its current form? In Hopi telling, the shift doesn't happen because people make one big obvious mistake. It happens because slowly the original instructions for right living are neglected. Ceremonies become empty performances. Leadership becomes corrupt. Power is hoarded instead of shared. The land is taken for granted instead of thanked and cared for. People stop listening to guidance from elders, from spiritual helpers, from the land itself. When that pattern becomes entrenched enough, the ending is not a surprise twist. It's an inevitability. The stories of the first, second, and third worlds are 3 long case studies in how that inevitability plays out under different conditions. Each world fails in its own way. Each ends under a different element. But the root cause, the unravelling of balance, is always there. So now, with that framework in mind, we can look at the first of those worlds. What kind of life did it represent? Where did the imbalance begin? And how did that first great ending arrive? Before we walk into the first world, we need to know who's in the room. Because in Hopi accounts, worlds don't just drift into existence on their own and then fall apart by accident. There are beings who set them in motion, beings who try to keep them on track, and beings, humans, who keep having to decide whether to listen. In the public versions of these stories, one of the most frequently mentioned figures is the creator, often called Taiwa. You can think of Taiwa as the originating mind or force. Not a bearded sky dad micromanaging daily life, but the one who sets the pattern. Taiwa conceives the worlds, sets the basic order, gives the initial instructions for how things are supposed to relate. But Taiwa doesn't usually work alone. There's a helper, a kind of architect or organizer, Sotuknung, who takes that original design and turns it into actual worlds, actual places, actual conditions of life. Where Taiwa represents intention, Sotuknang represents implementation. Building, unbuilding, rebuilding. Then there are the ones who deal directly with living beings, especially humans. One of the most important of these, again, in the versions that have been shared publicly, is Spider-Woman, often called Kokangwuti. She's a creator in her own right, a life-giver, a teacher. In some tellings she shapes the first people out of clay, or sings them into form. In others, she's the one who guides survivors between worlds, giving them the means to travel through dangerous transitions. If Taiwa is like the original blueprint and Sotuknang is the engineer, Spider-Woman is the one sitting next to you, showing you how to weave your own strand into that design. She teaches, counsels, corrects. She is, in many accounts, the voice that says, "Remember what you were told. Remember how to live." Different clans and villages will emphasize different helpers. Some stories feature warrior beings or kachinas associated with rain, fertility, or specific mountains. Others emphasize the role of Masor, a powerful, often unsettling figure who presides over the fourth world and reminds humans of their responsibilities. The names and roles shift, but the pattern is consistent. There is a layered reality, and in that layered reality some beings have the job of guiding, warning, and if necessary, ending. Crucially, though, these beings are not puppeteers and humans are not marionettes. In Hopi thought, as it's been publicly described, human agency is central. People are given instructions, they're warned. They see examples, good and bad. They're told, sometimes very bluntly, what will happen if they break certain agreements with each other and with the land. And then they act anyway. The first, second and third worlds don't collapse, because Taiwa wakes up in a bad mood. They collapse because over time, human choices pull the whole system out of alignment. Greed, cruelty, neglect of ceremony, abuse of power. These are decisions, not fate. Even when sorcerers, destructive beings, or corrupt leaders enter the picture, they're not alien invaders. They're humans using the same capacities everyone else has, but in a way that violates the original instructions. So when the stories say that Sotuk Nang, on behalf of the Creator, brought fire on the first world, or ice on the second, or flood on the third, it can sound on the surface like pure punishment. Do wrong, get smited, end of story. But if you listen to the way elders often frame it, it's not just about anger. It's about correction, reset. The world as a pattern of relationships has been twisted so far that it can't untangle itself from the inside. The ceremonies that are supposed to renew balance are being performed for show. The leaders who are supposed to guide people are guiding them deeper into corruption. The land is being pushed past its limits. Under those conditions, punishment is less like an arbitrary jail sentence and more like shutting down a failing system before it causes even greater damage. In that sense, destruction is also mercy, not for the people who insist on clinging to the old pattern, but for the possibility of life going forward at all. Fire, ice, and flood strip away the excess. They remove the structures and habits that have become too entrenched to reform. A few people, those who listened to guidance, who kept some part of the original agreement alive, are given a way out. Often that way out comes through a helper being, Spider-Woman advising them to build a reed, a raft, a way to climb, Kachina spirits giving signs and instructions, Masor later setting terms for how life in the next world must be lived. And in nearly every telling there are warnings first. The warnings can come in many forms: dreams, ceremonial messages, direct instructions from spiritual helpers, elders noticing that ceremonies are no longer being conducted properly, that people are hoarding instead of sharing, that certain taboos are being broken. The stories make it clear the end never arrives out of nowhere. There is always a period when change is still possible. That's where human choice shows up most starkly. Some people hear the warnings and adjust. They restore neglected ceremonies. They stop exploiting others. They realign with the land and with the Creator's instructions. Others hear the same warnings and laugh them off, or they refuse to give up the comforts that imbalance has brought them. Or they're so lost in their own power that they literally can't imagine the world changing. The line between those two responses is often what separates survivors from everyone else. So when we talk about the first world ending in fire, or the second in ice, or the third in flood, we're not just talking about elemental spectacle. We're talking about a conversation that failed. Guidance offered, guidance ignored. Warnings given, warnings dismissed. Endings in this framework are what happens when warnings don't work anymore. Keep that in mind as we step into the story of the first world. A creator sets the pattern. Helpers walk among the people, teaching and correcting. Signs of imbalance start to appear. Warnings are given. The question isn't, will some higher power destroy the world? The question is, what do people do with the guidance they're given, and how long can a world survive when that guidance is set aside? If you trace the story all the way back, the first world is not a golden age. It's more like childhood. In many Hopi tellings that have been made public, the first world is described as simple, close to the Creator, and in the beginning at least, peaceful. People live where they're placed. They follow the instructions they've been given. They know who made them. They know who teaches them. And life is relatively ordered. But simple doesn't mean perfect, and peaceful doesn't mean finished. The first world is an early stage of humanity, not just in time, but in development. Humans here are new to being human. They're learning how to live in bodies, how to relate to each other, how to handle the power of choice. They're like children who've just been shown how the house works, where the food is, how to use the tools, what not to touch, but haven't yet figured out how easily they can burn the place down. In that sense, the first world is often less about technology and more about relationship. People live close to their helpers. Spider-Woman, in some versions, walks among them, teaching them how to weave, how to plant, how to pray. The connection between daily life and sacred instruction is tight. You don't need elaborate ceremonies to remember what you were told. The memory is still fresh. And yet, right from the start, there's a shadow built into that setup. Because the moment you give beings real freedom, you introduce the possibility they won't use it well. Across different accounts, 3 kinds of imbalance show up again and again in the first world. The first is conflict. At some point, people stop seeing themselves as all part of one family and start dividing. They argue, they fight, they form factions. Petty grievances harden into serious disputes. Violence becomes thinkable. The second is pride. People begin to feel superior over each other, over other creatures, even over the very forces that created and sustain them. They forget that their abilities are gifts and start treating them as proof they're entitled to more. More land, more power, more control. Pride turns into contempt, and contempt makes cruelty easier. The third is forgetting the instructions. This forgetting isn't usually portrayed as a sudden wipe of the slate. It's erosion at first. Maybe people shorten the ceremonies because they're busy. Then they start skipping certain offerings because they seem unnecessary. Old taboos get bent just this once. Stories that were supposed to be told every year become hazy. Details get dropped. What was once a living agreement with the Creator and the land becomes a vague background belief. Conflict, pride, forgetting, those are the seeds of collapse. If you hear first world, it's very easy to imagine an entire physical planet being constructed, populated, and then literally blown apart. In some retellings, it can sound like that, a whole world consumed by fire and replaced with a brand new one. But in Hopi thought, the word world can also mean something more subtle, a way of life, a pattern of relationships, a complete package of conditions, social, spiritual, environmental, within which people exist. A world in this sense is not just rock and atmosphere. It's how people understand themselves, how they organize, what they value, and how they live with the land and with unseen forces. So when the first world ends, it may not be about a planet vanishing. It may be about a whole mode of life becoming non-viable. Think of it as a system that works until it doesn't. Early humanity in the first world is still learning how to handle abundance and scarcity, how to distribute resources, how to resolve arguments without destroying each other. They have instructions, but they don't yet have deep experience with the consequences of ignoring them. So when conflict and pride start to grow, the society doesn't have much in the way of shock absorbers. Now layer in the natural world. The stories don't usually read like climate reports, but they're full of environmental hints. Harshness, struggle, times when food becomes hard to find, or when certain places can't sustain life the way they used to. Some versions speak of the earth warming, of things heating up, both morally and physically. It's not hard to imagine that behind the First World narrative are memories of real periods of instability, droughts, long dry seasons, sudden storms, failing harvests. To people living close to the land, changes in rainfall patterns or growing seasons wouldn't have been abstract phenomena. They would have been immediate, terrifying, and very obviously connected to whether or not people were keeping up their side of the agreement. In that light, the First World can be read as a metaphor for an early human society perched on the edge of environmental limits. A world where cooperation is not optional, where any rise in conflict and hoarding makes everyone more vulnerable to the next bad season. Where one more year of prideful overreach can push entire communities past the point of recovery. When the stories say people began to forget the instructions, it's not just about prayer formulas. It's about practical survival ethics being abandoned. Share the water, don't exhaust the soil, don't abuse power. Don't treat other beings as disposable. These are not just ritual rules, they're adaptation strategies. Ignore them long enough, and the environment stops being forgiving. So the First World represents a phase where humanity is close to its teachers but far from maturity. A phase where spiritual and ecological balance are still intertwined. But the capacity to break that balance has finally come online. People are powerful enough to cause real damage, but not wise enough yet to restrain themselves consistently. From here, the story starts leaning toward its central tension. If a world is really a way of being, an entire pattern of life, then what does it mean to say that pattern ends in fire? Is the fire an actual conflagration? A series of volcanic eruptions or intense droughts remembered as a single blaze? A moral description of a society overheated with violence, greed, and rage, or some fusion of all three? And, beneath that, another question. What kind of ending would make sense as a teaching? If you want to warn future generations what happens when conflict, pride, and forgetfulness go unchecked, what images do you choose? How do you show that imbalance doesn't just make things bad, it pushes an entire way of life past a threshold it can't come back from? Hold that thought as we move to the next part of the story. Because in Hopi tradition, the First World doesn't just fade away, it reaches a point of no return. The heat rises in more ways than one, and a particular kind of ending is set in motion. When Hopi elders talk publicly about the end of the First World, one word keeps coming back: fire. Sometimes it's the world burned, sometimes it's the world became hot. In English retellings, you'll often hear phrases like the world was destroyed by fire, or everything was consumed by heat. If you stack those accounts next to creation stories from other cultures, it looks familiar. You get echoes of Hindu yugas ending in flame, Norse worlds going down in Ragnarok's fire, Christian images of a world purified by burning at the end of days. The pattern shows up so often it's tempting to file it away as just another version of a universal fire apocalypse myth. But in the Hopi material that's been shared openly, fire isn't just one thing. Sometimes it sounds physical in some tellings. The ground itself heats up. Springs dry out. The sun seems to grow more intense. People can't find coolness, can't escape the heat. Other versions speak of great fires racing across the land, or of something like molten stone. The word choices in English, burning, scorching, lava, are doing their best to translate concepts that don't always map neatly onto Western geology, but the sensory impression is clear. This is a world where heat has become unbearable. Other times, fire is more social. People are hot with anger. Their hearts burn with jealousy, greed, lust for power. Conflicts that used to be cooled down by elders or ceremonies start to flare out of control. The atmosphere is one of agitation, not calm. The temperature of daily life rises. Hot words, hot tempers, hot desires. In that sense, the fire that ends the First World is as much about emotional and spiritual overheating as it is about actual flames. And then there's a third layer, fire as judgment and reset. In many indigenous North American traditions, when the world goes out of balance, the corrective force is not random. It's portrayed as something allowed or sent by higher powers once they've given enough warnings. In Hopi accounts, you often get this pattern. Instructions are given, those instructions are ignored, signals and smaller consequences appear, people don't listen, and finally a decisive event comes that no one can dodge. Fire becomes the tool that finishes what human choices started. So what actually happened? If you're hoping for a neat answer like a single supervolcano erupted in year X and that's the First World, there isn't one. Hopi tradition is not a seismology report, but that doesn't mean the stories float free of the land. The Southwest, broadly defined from what is now Arizona and New Mexico, out through the Colorado Plateau and down into Mexico, is a region built by fire. Layered volcanic fields, basalt flows, cinder cones, lava tubes. If you've ever walked across those black, broken rocks under a summer sun, you know what the earth was too hot to live on can feel like in your body. There are historic memories among different Pueblo and neighbouring peoples of volcanic activity and the landscapes it leaves behind. Great mesas split, new mountains appearing in a lifetime, smoke and ash darkening the sky, or strange red glows on the horizon. Add to that the everyday presence of wildfire. Before modern fire suppression, lightning-sparked fires were a regular part of life in the Southwest. Dry grasslands, pinyon juniper woodlands, ponderosa pine forests, they all burn. In bad drought years they burn explosively. A dry lightning storm can set multiple fires in a single afternoon. Winds can push flames for miles. To people living in small scattered communities, a season like that would feel like the whole world was on fire, especially if the flames intersected with fields, homes, or sacred sites. Now, layering climate. The Southwest climate history is a patchwork of long droughts, heat spikes, and abrupt swings. We know from tree rings and lake sediments that there were prolonged mega-droughts in the region long before written records. Years when rainfall plummeted, rivers shrank, springs failed, and temperatures soared. Crops would have withered, game would have moved away or died, dust and heat would have settled in. To people whose survival depended on rain ceremonies and community discipline, a runaway drought would not have just been bad weather, it would have been moral feedback, evidence that something was wrong in the way people were living. The First World burning could easily encode a memory of that kind of event, or of several such events layered together. The land getting hotter, literally and figuratively, as social cohesion broke down and environmental stress rose. Could volcanic stories have fed into that? It's possible. The Hopi mesas sit within sight of volcanic fields. To the west you have the San Francisco Peaks region, a classic example of a complex volcanic landscape. To the east and south, other fields. To a people whose sacred geography includes mountains, springs, and unusual rock formations, those fire-built features are not just scenery, they're part of a storied world. Over generations, tales of a time before the mountains cooled or before the black rock hardened could easily merge with moral teachings about what happens when humanity oversteps. When you place Hopi accounts next to other world-by-fire myths across the globe, patterns emerge, but they don't all point to the same thing. In Greek myth, Phaethon loses control of the sun chariot and scorches the earth. In some Hindu texts, the world is destroyed by fire at the end of a cosmic cycle. In some Pacific and African traditions, early worlds are overcooked, dried out, baked until uninhabitable. Often there's a combination of human arrogance, disobedience, or misuse of sacred power leading to an environmental catastrophe framed as burning. Is that convergence just humans everywhere being afraid of fire? Or humans everywhere living through heat waves, wildfires and eruptions, trying to make sense of them? Probably both. This is where we have to be careful. It's tempting to say, see, Hopi First World equals global myth of fiery apocalypse, equals record of some single prehistoric event that affected everyone. But myths are not telegrams stamped with dates and GPS coordinates. They're living models that compress many experiences into one story. In the Hopi case, the world ended in fire might be doing several jobs at once. On one level, it may remember very concrete phenomena, extended drought, lightning fires, maybe distant or local volcanic activity. On another, it's describing what it feels like when a society runs too hot, when anger and greed and status competition start to consume everything. On yet another, it's a teaching device, a vivid way to say there is a limit. If you ignore the instructions long enough, the system won't just wobble. It will cross a threshold, and when it does, the ending will be fast and irreversible, like a room catching fire. All of those layers can coexist without cancelling each other out. You don't have to pick between symbolic and literal. In traditional narratives, those categories weren't separate the way modern people often imagine. A drought is both a meteorological event and a comment on failed obligations. A wildfire is both combustion chemistry and a message that boundaries have been breached. So when elders say the first world was destroyed by fire, we can hear it several ways at once, as a hint that early communities in this lineage lived through periods of real punishing heat and flame, as a description of social and moral overheating, as a warning that when things get too hot inside people and outside them, a way of life can ignite and collapse faster than anyone expects. What we can't do, if we're being honest, is flatten that richness into a single explanation that makes us comfortable. We don't know exactly which drought, which eruption, which fire season, if any, sits behind the story. The point of the teaching isn't to satisfy our curiosity about geological history. It's to make listeners feel the stakes of imbalance. Because in Hopi tradition, the first world doesn't end with a minor course correction. It ends with a burn so total that only those who have stayed close to the instructions, and the helpers, find a way through. And that's where the story turns from destruction to survival. If fire closes one world, how do you get to the next without being consumed? Who gets shown the exit? What does a doorway out of a burning way of life look like? To answer that, we have to follow the people who listen in time, and the strange, almost otherworldly passages they're offered as everything around them goes up in flames. In the Hopi stories that have been shared, the people who make it out of that burning first world don't do it by accident. They don't just happen to be standing in the right spot when the ground splits open. They're not randomly lucky. Survival is tied to a very specific pattern: listening, preparation, and willingness to move when everything familiar is falling apart. This is where the idea of emergence enters the picture. In English, emergence sounds abstract, like a philosophy term. In the Hopi context, it's much more concrete. It means to come up, to come out, to move into a new condition of the world. It's a transition, but not just a gentle fade from one scene to another. It's a threshold. The first world is not simply reformed or repaired, it ends. A new order has to be entered. In many versions of the story, there's a point where the creator or one of the helpers, figures like Spider-Woman, basically says, "This world can't be fixed in place." The imbalance is too deep. The only solution is to leave it behind and rise into another. That rising is emergence, and it doesn't happen out in the open on a wide road where everyone can see it coming. It happens through something very small, a narrow passage, a reed, a hole, a sipapu. Over and over you see this image. A stalk of reed, or a hollow plant, or a tiny opening in the earth, water or sky that becomes the way through. The people climb into it, or up it, or through it, and when they come out they find themselves in a different world. On the surface, that looks like fantasy. Humans don't migrate through reeds. But as a metaphor, it's powerful. Think about what a reed or small opening represents. It's fragile, it's easy to miss, it's not for crowds. You have to bend down, humble yourself, squeeze, trust that there's something on the other side. You can't carry a lot with you. You definitely can't bring an entire burning civilization through a space like that. You're not moving the world, you're moving yourselves. This is where guidance and selection show up. In the stories, it's not everyone everywhere that hears about the portal. It's certain groups, certain families, certain clans who have stayed in relationship with the teachings and the helpers. Spider-Woman or another sacred guide warns them early, gives them instructions, tells them to plant reeds or to follow a particular sign or to gather at a certain place when the time comes. They have advance notice, but they also have homework. They're often told to build something, to weave something, to prepare food, to maintain ceremonies even when the larger society has stopped. In other words, to stay ready long before there's visible proof that disaster is imminent. From the outside, that probably looked unnecessary, maybe even foolish. While the majority are chasing excitement, wealth, status, the hot desires that helped bring the first world down, these smaller groups are engaged in what looks like repetitive, low-status work, planting reeds, maintaining shrines, keeping older rhythms. Only later does it become obvious that this quiet discipline is the price of admission. Because when the heat finally becomes unbearable, there's no time to improvise. You can't plant reeds after the ground is already on fire. You can't repair relationships with the helpers when you've ignored them for generations. The people who have kept those connections alive are the ones who can hear and trust the instruction to enter the narrow way out. So survival is ethical, not just technical. The stories don't say the smartest engineers escaped, or the strongest warriors forced their way through. They say, in one way or another, those who kept the instructions, who remembered gratitude and balance, were led to a place of emergence. This doesn't mean a simplistic good people live, bad people die formula. The ethics here are more about alignment than purity. Are you aligned with the forces that created and sustain the world? What Hopi sometimes speak of in terms of right conduct, right relationships, proper ceremony? Or are you aligned with the forces that are overheating it? Greed, violence, contempt for limits. In that sense, the portal is a sorting device, not a gate. An authority figure slams in people's faces at the last minute, but a gradual narrowing of possibility as a way of life burns itself out. By the time the first world is ending, many people simply cannot fit through the reed or see the opening because the habits that would have prepared them for it were abandoned long before. There's another layer here. Portals in Hopi narratives are liminal spaces between states, between identities. You're not just changing your address, you're changing what kind of being you are and what kind of world you participate in. Emerging into a new world means you can't keep all the old patterns. The passage itself strips some of them away. You might leave behind wealth, status, even parts of your social structure. You carry through what is essential: knowledge, songs, prayers, a core of relationships that held fast under pressure. Anthropologists sometimes talk about rites of passage in this way: separation, transition, incorporation. You leave a known order, you pass through a confusing in-between phase, you come out redefined. The Hopi emergence stories are doing something similar, but on a cosmic scale. A whole way of life is led into the in-between, and only a remnant comes out the other side as the seed of a new world. If you zoom out, you can already see the cycle forming. First, there's a warning. Teachings are given about how to live in balance. Then comes the long slide into imbalance. People drift. Comfort and novelty outrun discipline. The social temperature rises. Next comes the ending. Not always overnight, but decisive when it comes. In the first world, that ending is told through fire. Finally, there's emergence, a passage, a portal, a reed opening that allows those who have stayed closest to the instructions to move into a renewed order of the world. That pattern, warning, imbalance, ending, emergence, doesn't stop with the first world. It becomes the template. In the second world, the specific dangers change. The element that tells the story changes. But the structure, the idea that every world carries the seed of its own destruction and the seed of its own transition, stays the same. To see how that plays out, we have to follow humanity into a very different phase. A cooler world, a more complex society, and a new kind of collapse waiting on the horizon. In Hopi tellings, the second world isn't a reset back to zero. The people don't emerge into some blank, empty universe where nothing has been learned. They come carrying memory, instructions, and the lingering smell of smoke from the world they just left behind. So the second world starts in a kind of grace period. There is room, there is time. The pressures that burned the first world to the ground aren't immediately present. The stories often describe this new world as more spacious, more refined, sometimes even more advanced than the first. Animals, plants, forces of nature, all of them are still in communication with the people. The helpers are still close. The teachings are still fresh. And because of that, something important happens: growth. The people multiply. They explore. They start to develop new capabilities, ways of organizing themselves, ways of using knowledge, ways of shaping their environment that would have been impossible in the raw, early first world. If the first world was like humanity's childhood, intense, impulsive, living very close to the edge of survival, the second world is more like adolescence. You know enough to do more than just survive day to day. You can plan, coordinate, experiment. You're not constantly being chased by catastrophe. There's excess energy, extra time, surplus resources. And with that surplus comes risk, because the second world is where more shows up. More tools, more ideas, more complexity in how people relate to one another. Some versions of the narrative speak of people beginning to travel farther, to learn more about how the world works, to develop abilities that border on what we would call magical or technological. They experiment with arts, with crafts, with knowledge. They test the boundaries of what's possible. On the surface, that sounds like progress. And in many ways it is. The second world is a world of expansion. But in Hopi tradition, expansion is never neutral. It's always testing character. As people's abilities increase, so does the temptation to use those abilities in ways that pull them away from balance. The same intelligence that could deepen their relationship with the land can also be turned toward exploitation. The same social complexity that could strengthen community can also fragment it into competing factions. Over and over, Second World stories highlight a cluster of dangers that come with growth. Greed is one of the big ones, not just wanting enough to live well, but wanting more than your share. Hoarding, accumulating, using your knowledge or position to get advantages over others. Turning gifts into leverage. There's also misused knowledge. In some versions, people begin to discover powerful techniques or secrets that let them manipulate natural forces or each other. These powers might come from the creator initially, or from helpers, or from long observation of how the world works. But instead of being used with humility and restraint, they get used for show, for dominance, for entertainment. And then there's social fragmentation. As populations grow and abilities differentiate, people stop seeing themselves as one tightly knit group facing common dangers. Status hierarchies emerge. Some clans or some individuals decide that their path is superior. Old agreements begin to fray. Suspicion creeps in. This is a different kind of imbalance than the First World. The First World burns because appetites run wild in a relatively simple setting. The Second World destabilizes because the system itself becomes complex, layered, capable of magnifying both wisdom and foolishness. In that kind of world, humility stops being a nice personal virtue and becomes a survival technology. Traditional teachings hammer this point. When things are going well, when your fields are producing, when your ceremonies are smooth, when your tools work and your networks expand, that is precisely when you need to deepen gratitude, not relax it. Why? Because prosperity hides consequences. You can overuse a resource for a while without seeing immediate collapse. You can treat people unjustly for a while and still keep the appearance of order. You can bend rules, skip ceremonies, cut corners, and nothing explodes right away. The lag between action and consequence gets longer as systems grow more complex. And that delay is dangerous. It lets people convince themselves that their behavior has no cost. So Hopi and many other indigenous traditions emphasize humility during prosperity, the way a good climber emphasizes safety gear on the easy parts of a mountain. You don't throw away your rope just because the ledge feels wide under your feet. You're preparing for what happens if the ground suddenly changes. In Second World terms, humility looks like remembering who gave the gifts in the first place, keeping ceremonies even when you feel strong, sharing surplus instead of hoarding it, listening to limits, especially when you have the power to override them. Because the power itself is not the problem. The problem is that power accelerates whatever direction you're already leaning. If your society is leaning toward balance, toward reciprocity with the land, respect between groups, commitment to instruction, then new technologies, new organizational structures, and new knowledge can help you stabilize that. You can build storage systems that cushion droughts, communication networks that carry warnings quickly, rituals that hold big populations together. But if your society is leaning toward greed and fragmentation, the same tools become accelerants. Better organization makes exploitation more efficient. Deeper knowledge of natural processes makes it easier to strip mine fertility from a place. More sophisticated communication turns into propaganda and manipulation. In that sense, the Second World in Hopi narrative weirdly overlaps with what scientists describe when they talk about tipping points in complex systems. You get feedback loops. A little inequality makes it easier to create more inequality. A small break in trust makes it harder to cooperate the next time, which then justifies even more self-protective behavior. A minor misuse of knowledge raises the stakes so that the next misuse has farther to fall. And because everything is more interconnected, local imbalances spread faster and farther than they did in the simpler First World. A quarrel between groups can ripple into widespread conflict. A disrespect toward a particular place can echo through entire regions of climate and food. So the Second World is a warning about a specific kind of advancement that forgets why the gifts were given. Advancement that inflates the self and shrinks responsibility. Advancement that makes you so effective at getting what you want that you stop asking whether you should want it at all. The Hopi stories don't say, don't grow. They don't idealize some frozen, primitive simplicity. They say growth without balance becomes its own kind of disaster. Technological or social power isn't evil. It just shortens the time between intention and impact. If you have the power to move rivers, build vast roads, or send information across the world in an instant, any distortion in your values gets stamped onto the landscape very quickly. Imbalance that once took generations to manifest can now unfold in years. So the second world poses an uncomfortable question, one that reaches past myth and right into modern life. What is the real cost of advancement if balance is lost? If a society can do more but listens less, if it can produce more but share less, if it can know more but refuses to be guided, at what point does progress tip over into a new form of destruction? In the Hopi cycle, that question isn't theoretical. The second world doesn't just drift forever in a state of manageable tension. The patterns of greed, misused knowledge, and social fragmentation eventually solidify into something the world itself can't support. And when that happens, the element that tells the story changes again. The heat of the first world gives way to something colder, slower, but just as final. To understand what ended the second world and what kind of warning it might hold for us, we have to step into a universe where the danger isn't burning, it's freezing. In Hopi accounts, the end of the second world doesn't come as a dramatic explosion from within. It comes as a withdrawal, a chilling, a kind of turning away. The motif that carries this is ice and cold. Sometimes it's described as the world freezing over, or snows and frosts that don't leave, or a great cold that sweeps over everything. Not just a rough winter, but a reversal so deep that the entire pattern of life is broken. On the surface, that sounds like a simple natural disaster story. First world, burned. Second world, frozen. Third world, drowned. Fire, ice, flood. It's like a neatly organized set of elements. But the Hopi way of telling isn't just about elements as weather. It's about elements as behaviour. So when you hear that the second world is ended by cold, there are at least two layers to listen for. One is literal, an environment that turns harsh, unlivable, suddenly unforgiving. The other is relational, a climate of the heart and mind turning cold. Let's start with the obvious possibility. Could the Great Cold preserve some memory of real climatic events? Earth history is full of abrupt temperature swings you could absolutely experience as the world's suddenly freezing. During the last few million years, the planet has cycled through repeated ice ages, long glacial periods broken by shorter, warmer interglacials. Within those big swings, you get even sharper spikes. Centuries where temperatures plunge or rise far faster than most ecosystems can comfortably track. Ice cores and ocean sediments show patterns like this over and over. Temperatures drop several degrees in a human lifetime. Rain belts move. Rivers dry up or relocate. Grasslands become deserts, or tundra creeps south. To people living inside those shifts, it wouldn't look like a gentle background change. It would feel like the rules of the world had just changed without warning. You don't actually need a global ice sheet rolling over everything to feel like the world is freezing. You just need growing seasons that fail, animals that don't return, snowpack that lingers too long, or cold snaps that keep killing your young. So when Hopi stories talk about the second world being ended by cold, one plausible reading is that they're echoing very old experiences of climatic reversal, times when abundance and expansion hit a hard environmental wall. And they wouldn't be the only ones up in the North Atlantic cultures. There are sagas of Thimble Winter, the great winter before the end of the world, 3 consecutive winters with no summer in between. In some Siberian and circumpolar traditions, there are tales of times when the sky dropped, the snow rose, the sun disappeared for many days, animals went away, and people had to change everything about how they lived. Even in Mesoamerica, where we tend to think about drought and maize and heat, there are mythic accounts of ages where the sun fails, light diminishes, or the sky chills. The details differ, but the motif is the same. A world of expansion and relative comfort runs straight into a wall of cold. From a scientific perspective, it's extremely hard to take any one of these stories and say, this is clearly about that particular event 12,900 years ago, or this one must be describing the Younger Dryas, or, here's the fingerprint of a specific volcanic winter. Climate science can point to many episodes that might fit the emotional profile: a pleasant regime abruptly cut off by cooling, snow, crop failures, game migrations thrown off. Myth can preserve the pattern of experience without preserving specific dates and mechanisms. So instead of trying to pin the Second World on one discrete geophysical event, it's more honest to say abrupt cold snaps and rapid climate reversals are a real part of Earth's operating system. Human communities have lived through them many times. It would actually be surprising if none of those experiences ever filtered into oral tradition. But if you only read the ice in Second World stories as ancient meteorology, you miss something just as important. The Hopi term for imbalance is not just about physical misfortune. It's about a breakdown in relationship between people, between clans, between humans and the other beings they share the world with. In that sense, cold starts long before the temperature drops. Cold is when generosity freezes into hoarding, when greeting one another with respect gets replaced by calculation. What can I get from you? When ceremonies which are supposed to be living, reciprocal relationships with forces of nature become hollow performances or get skipped because they're inconvenient. Remember what was happening in the Second World: growth, complexity, differentiation, more tools, more power, more status differences, people drifting into camps, favouring some and excluding others. From the inside, that social shift can feel exactly like a change in weather. The warmth of shared obligation fades. The comfort of knowing you're held in a network of reciprocity thins out. Suspicion and competition take its place. You might still be living in the same physical climate, and yet experience your world as colder. So in one reading, the ice that ends the Second World is the physical echo of that moral and emotional cooling. The teachings are blunt about this. If you act as if you don't need the land can act as if it doesn't need you. If you treat other beings, including other humans, as objects to use rather than relatives to care for, don't be shocked when care withdraws. In modern language we might say, you lose resilience. You've burned your bridges with the systems that would have helped you through a shock. You've degraded the soil, the forests, the trust networks, the shared rituals. So when the next perfectly natural climate swing shows up, because they always do, you don't have the buffers your ancestors had. From the outside, a later storyteller might say, the world froze us out. From the inside, the teachings say, we made ourselves fragile, then blamed the weather. This is where the Hopi cycle lines up in a subtle way with other world of ice stories. In a lot of those traditions, the Cold Age doesn't just punish random people. It exposes something. It reveals arrogance, shows who or what is really dependable, strips away illusions of control. Those who survive are the ones who maintained warmth of heart, of obligation, of discipline before the snow came. The Hopi emphasis is similar. The Second World doesn't end just because a cold front rolls through. It ends because a pattern of imbalance means the people can't adapt when the environment flips. So is the Second World's ice about ancient glacial episodes or about ethical climate? The careful answer is it doesn't have to choose. Hopi teachings aren't either raw data about past environments or pure metaphor with no historical content. They can be memory and metaphor at the same time. They can remember that there were times when the world turned cold, brutally and without negotiation. And they can frame that memory inside a lesson. Your best defense against sudden reversal isn't control over the sky. It's the quality of your relationships before the reversal arrives. Because in this cycle, every element, fire, ice, water, has the same job. It doesn't just destroy, it reveals what you've been building all along. If you grew up in a world that could flip from feast to famine, warmth to killing cold, with very little warning, what would you want your grandchildren to know? You don't have satellite records, you don't have spreadsheets of rainfall data. You have seasons, you have sky, you have the bones of animals and the rings in old trees, and you have something evolution has been fine-tuning for millions of years, a brain built for stories. Oral traditions are not random collections of cool tales people made up around a fire because they were bored. They're information systems. They're how memory moves through time when you don't have writing. And they do it by wrapping raw experience in shapes that stick. Repetition, rhythm, character, moral stakes, striking images. These aren't just literary flourishes, they're mnemonic technology. A story about the time the river ran backward and swallowed the fields is weird enough, emotional enough, that kids will ask for it again and again. They'll remember it as adults, and 50, 100, 500 years later, people are still hearing about what happens when you build too close to a river that can suddenly flood in the wrong direction. But there are trade-offs. Oral traditions are very good at preserving patterns and very bad at preserving exact timelines. Under constant retelling, dates blur, sequences compress. 10 different bad years can get folded into a single archetypal great drought. Centuries of back and forth warming and cooling might be remembered as one decisive flip from warmth to ice. Symbolism grows around the core like coral. Each generation adds emphasis, sharpens the lesson, attaches new meanings. A story that began as, "The lake dried up twice in my grandmother's time, so don't be careless with water," can, over enough generations, become, "In the second world, the people misused their gifts, and the spirits turned away, and then the great dryness came." From inside the tradition, that's not distortion. That's refinement. The point isn't to keep a perfect archive of barometric readings. The point is to transmit a pattern. Actions have consequences. Certain ways of relating to land and to each other increase your odds of surviving reversals. Others strip away your safety nets. You can see this logic in how many cultures bind landscapes and extreme events into teaching stories. A cliff where rocks fall is not just dangerous terrain. It becomes the place where someone ignored warnings, boasted, and was crushed. A low, fertile but flood-prone plain becomes the valley where an arrogant chief refused to move the village, and water remembered its old path. Storm tracks become personalities. Prevailing winds become beings with preferences. Volcanoes are not just vents in the crust, they are mountains that punish greed, or guardians that send ash as a warning before the truly destructive eruption. These stories don't just explain, they instruct. They tell you how close you can build to that river. They tell you which months you never travel across that pass. They encode that certain kinds of behaviour, overhunting, hoarding, cutting too much forest, tended to be followed by very bad times, even if the exact causal chain was invisible. Over deep time, extreme events get pulled toward mythic centres. Fire, ice, flood, darkness, great wind. It's not because people couldn't tell the difference between a frost and an ice age. It's because, from a human perspective, both belong to the same family of experience. We thought the world worked one way. Suddenly, it didn't. Many died. Now, from the outside, with geology and climate science in hand, it's tempting to treat these narratives like encrypted data sets and go hunting for one-to-one matches. Oh, that must be the outburst flood, when a glacial lake broke its dam. This has to be the volcanic winter from that famous eruption. This Cold Age story? Definitely the Younger Dryas. Case closed. It's not that simple. There's an important difference between evidence and resonance. Evidence is when a story nails specific, testable details that match independent physical records in ways that are hard to explain by chance. For example, an oral history that remembers a coastline where the sea came in farther than any hunter could shoot an arrow, tied to a particular inlet, and you find geological signatures of a large tsunami there around the time frame when that culture occupied it. That's the kind of thing scholars get excited about. Resonance is when the general pattern of experience in a story lines up with what we know often happens on this planet. Drought following deforestation, floods intensifying after river modification, cooling after big volcanic eruptions, without being able to tie that story to a specific, dated event. The Hopi cycle of worlds, the burning, the freezing, the flooding, has a lot of resonance with the way Earth systems actually behave. Fire, ice, and water really have rearranged the map of habitability again and again. Human communities really have risen during stable, favourable windows and then crashed or migrated when those windows snapped shut. But for the most part, these stories don't come with coordinates and calendar years. If we're honest, that makes them a poor source of precise paleoclimate data and an excellent source of something else: phenomenology, a record of what it felt like to live through instability, a record of what people concluded, ethically and practically, about how to behave in a world that can turn on them. So the careful standard is this: we can notice and explore the ways Hopi teachings rhyme with known patterns in geology and climate science. We can say these motifs make sense on a planet shaped by ice ages and megadroughts. We can even propose hypotheses. Maybe some features of the Second World echo memories of real cold snaps, or the flood of the Third World echoes ancestral experiences with rising waters. But we don't force the teachings to be proto-geology textbooks. We don't strip them of their moral architecture to mine them for data points. And we don't claim a scientific proof where, at best, we have an intriguing overlap between different ways of knowing. Respecting the tradition means letting it be what it is, a living system of memory and instruction, not a puzzle box we solve and discard once we've decoded it. From that vantage point, the Hopi worlds are not just ancient weather reports. They're long reflections on how humans inhabit cycles of stability and shock. Which brings us to the third world, the one that looks uncomfortably like our own. A world of high achievement, immense power, incredible infrastructure, and a growing sense that the very things that make life easy are quietly unbalancing the ground it rests on. In Hopi accounts, the third world is the one where everything works until it doesn't. If the first world is simple life and raw instinct, and the second world is expansion and experiment, the third world is what happens when a species really figures itself out. Tools become technologies, villages become networks. People learn not just to live with the forces around them, but to harness them. This is the world where humans master agriculture on a large scale, shape water, build extensive settlements, coordinate labour across long distances. Stories speak of great cities, long roads, brilliant minds. People can move food, stone, wood, information. They can plan not just seasons ahead, but generations. In other words, this is the first truly high-energy human world. And at first, that looks like a blessing. Harvests grow. Populations increase, trade flourishes. Specialists emerge who don't have to gather or farm because other people's surplus can support them. Ritual systems become more elaborate. Political structures become more complex. There is enough stability that people can afford art, philosophy, grand projects. But in the Hopi framing, all of this is happening on one condition: that people remember why they have these gifts in the first place. That memory is not abstract, it's encoded in daily practice, prayer, humility, respect for limits, offerings made before taking, instructions about how much you can use and how to give back. It's an ongoing conversation between humans, land, and the beings that inhabit it. In the third world, those conversations start to go one way. Power concentrates. The ability to command labor, to store food, to control violence, settles into fewer and fewer hands. Some people begin to live very well, insulated from bad years. Others start to find that all the risk and instability that used to be shared is now pushed down onto them. And once there are winners and losers on that scale, stories say something shifts inside people. This is where the warnings begin to sound familiar. Corruption, warfare, exploitation, forgetting sacred responsibilities. Corruption in this sense isn't just taking bribes. It's a kind of spiritual erosion. People who once saw themselves as caretakers of a gift begin to see themselves as owners of a resource. Leaders who were supposed to serve the balance start serving their own prestige. Ritual becomes performance, obligations become optional. Warfare, too, changes its character. Conflict has always existed in Hopi stories. Humans are not imagined as naturally conflict-free. But in the third world, fighting is no longer just about a grazing area or a personal insult. It's organized, calculated, technological. People build for war. They innovate for war. They form alliances and betray them, not because they must survive, but because they want more. Exploitation follows naturally. If your tools and organization let you pull more out of the land than ever before, and your moral checks are dull, you start to overreach. You cut more forest than regrowth can handle. You dam and divert more water than the rivers can stand. You demand more labor from people than their bodies and spirits can give. The Hopi way of telling it makes an important point here. The crisis starts inside before it shows up outside. From a traditional perspective, when people forget their covenant with the Creator, when they stop saying thank you, stop honouring the boundaries they were given, stop sharing fairly, this is already disaster. The droughts, the plagues, the floods that may follow are symptoms, not root causes. It's an inversion of how we often talk about collapse in modern terms. We tend to say external shock hits, climate change, pandemic, crop failure, and then society falls into chaos, corruption, war. The Hopi narrative often reverses the arrow. Internal disorder accumulates, unbalances the relationship between people and the world, and then the world responds. Whether or not you accept that metaphysics literally, there's a psychological insight baked into it. Because once enough people believe that the rules no longer apply, that nobody else is honouring their obligations, certain things begin to unravel fast. Trust thins out. Why plant for the long term if powerful neighbours might seize your storehouses? Why observe water-sharing agreements if upstream communities are quietly diverting more than their share? Why send your children to help with communal work if the benefits are being hoarded? Division creeps in, first in whispers, then in open splits. Clans and groups that once cooperated begin to keep separate calendars, separate ceremonies, separate councils. Each tells itself that it is preserving the real way, and that others have strayed. The teachings describe people who refuse to listen, not to one another, and not to the messengers and reminders that keep trying to pull them back. Figures appear in the stories whose job is to warn. Sometimes they're humble elders, sometimes spiritual beings, sometimes animals that speak. They come saying versions of the same thing. Remember the instructions, you are crossing lines that have consequences. There is still time to turn around. And again, in the third world narratives, those warnings get brushed aside. People are too busy, too invested, too proud. Life still looks good from the centre of power. The granaries are still full, the roads still hum, the ceremonies still draw crowds. The sky has not yet fallen. Why should they believe that the structure holding them up is already beginning to crack? Here the social consequences deepen. When you ignore early warnings, you need stronger justifications for continuing on the same path. So the stories talk about mockery. People who still try to live simply, who insist on old practices of restraint and reciprocity, are laughed at as backward or fearful. The notion that you should limit growth or share surplus starts to sound naive. Children are raised in a world where excess is normal and speed is a virtue. Refusal to listen becomes more than stubbornness, it becomes identity. Admitting a need to change would mean admitting that your comfort, your prestige, maybe even your whole way of life, rests on a broken foundation. That's a hard thing for any culture to face. Across many indigenous traditions, including but not limited to the Hopi, there's a recurring pattern. The moment when people begin actively silencing those who remind them of obligations. Killing the messenger is not just a metaphor, it's a description of what happens when a society decides that its short-term trajectory is more important than the long-term web it's woven into. By this point in the Third World, the imbalance is no longer subtle. The land is stressed, the waters behave strangely. Seasons become less reliable, and yet the most powerful people are the ones least willing to interpret these changes as feedback. Instead, they often double down, using even more control, more extraction, more force to try to hold the system together. That's why in many tellings the ending of the Third World is described as the most dramatic of all. This is not a gentle correction or a localized burn. It's the point where slow drift passes a threshold and the whole world as known to those people becomes unsustainable. Decisions that once seemed isolated, this one forest cleared, this one river walled off, this one treaty broken, have braided together into a single trajectory. From inside the narrative it feels like an invisible timer has been running down the whole time. Warnings are the flashing light. Imbalance is the alarm. By the time people finally notice the sound, they're already standing on the edge. And in Hopi tradition, crossing that edge is not just political collapse or famine. It's a world ending, an upheaval big enough that only those who have paid attention to the old instructions have any chance of making it through what comes next. When the Third World finally breaks in Hopi tradition, it doesn't end with a slow fade out. It ends with water, not just a bad rainy season, not a single river overflowing its banks. A world reshaping flood. In many tellings the waters rise and keep rising. Springs that once gently fed fields become torrents. Rivers leave their beds. Rains stop following any recognizable pattern. The seas, however, people imagined them. Cross boundaries they were never supposed to cross. If the first world ends in fire and the second in cold, the third goes down under water. This is not a uniquely Hopi idea. Flood is one of the most widespread motifs in human storytelling. You find versions of it in Mesopotamia with Utnapishtim and his boat, in the Hebrew Bible with Noah's Ark, in India with Manu and the fish, in Mesoamerica, in the Pacific, in indigenous North and South American traditions from coast to coast. Change the names, change the landscape, and the script often repeats. People become corrupt or forgetful, warnings are ignored, water rises, a few prepared or chosen ones survive on some kind of vessel or refuge. Afterward, the world is cleaned, and life begins again. Why water? Why so often? Part of the answer is brutally simple. You don't have to exaggerate to make flood terrifying. Fire can sweep through, but it usually leaves visible edges. This burned, that didn't. Cold can be deadly, but it creeps. Water can erase the distinction between safe and not safe in a matter of hours. One day the river is a line, The next day, it's a moving horizon. The landscape you recognized in the morning can vanish by nightfall. You don't need a myth to remember that. A single catastrophic flood will imprint itself into collective memory for generations. Children who grow up listening to their grandparents' stories of houses carried away, fields buried in silt, relatives drowned. Those children don't have to experience the event to feel it. And across deep time, humans have lived next to rivers that shift, coasts that drown, and storm tracks that wander. Geology hints at this without giving us a neat one-to-one match with any single story. Around the world you find evidence of megafloods and abrupt hydrological events. Inland seas overtopping natural dams, glacial lakes bursting and sending walls of water racing across plains, rivers suddenly abandoning channels they had followed for centuries, coastal zones that were once dry land swallowed as sea levels rose after ice sheets melted. In the American Southwest and neighbouring regions, paleoclimate records show long periods where water was unreliable in both directions, severe drought, punctuated by episodes of extreme rain. There are signs of ancient lakes appearing and shrinking, of rivers switching course, of flood deposits laid down in single violent events. You can't tie those directly to Hopi narratives without stretching the data, but they show that people here, like people everywhere, lived through hydrological whiplash. So when Hopi stories say the Third World ended in flood, there are at least two ways to hear that. One is literal, something like a regional deluge or a series of devastating floods actually happened. Settlements built on river terraces and lowlands could have been wiped out. Irrigation systems that made high-energy societies possible might have been destroyed. From the vantage point of survivors, seeing all the known world centres of power and cultivation drowned or washed away, the world ended in water is not a poetic exaggeration. It's a fair description. The other way is symbolic. Water as the element that washes away an order that has rotted from within. In Hopi teaching, water isn't just a hazard, it's sacred. It's life. Rains are prayed for, courted, ceremonially invited. Springs and seeps are treated as living presences. To say that water rises against you is to say that the very gift you depended on turns into the agent of your correction. Flood, in this light, becomes a kind of global purification ritual. The excesses of the Third World, its pride, its overbuilding, its hoarded surplus, its refusal to listen, accumulate like grime. You could imagine each unjust act as a thin film on the surface of the world. Over time it thickens. Eventually, in the logic of the story, only a complete washing will do. That's why the cleansing motif is so strong. The flood is not just tragedy, it's reset. Afterward, the survivors emerge into a world stripped of its previous monuments. The great cities are gone, the roads are broken, the fortresses have melted back into the landscape. What remains are the essentials: land, water, seeds, instructions. In some versions of the Third World ending, people see the water coming. Messengers warn them. Certain clans are told to prepare reeds, hollow logs or boats. Others are told to move to higher ground, to certain mesas or mountains. There's a sense that the test is not whether the flood can be stopped. It can't. But whether anyone has maintained the relationship strong enough to be guided through it. Here, the literal and the symbolic fold into each other. On the literal level, people who pay attention to environmental signals and to intergenerational knowledge, where not to build when unusual cloud patterns matter, how to move quickly when rivers begin to rise, are more likely to survive hydrological disasters. On the symbolic level, people who maintain humility and restraint are the ones who can hear a warning that contradicts their comfort. From a psychological standpoint, flood stories are sticky because they are so visible and so totalizing. Drought can kill quietly. Forests thin out. wells deepen. Livestock die one by one. If you travel far enough, you might find a place where the crisis is less obvious. It's possible to deny a drought for a while, especially if you're insulated by wealth. Flood doesn't give you that luxury. You can stand on a hillside and watch water swallow the valley where you used to live. The boundary between your house and the river literally dissolves. Survivors who climb to safety can look down at a single unified surface and know that everything underneath has been rearranged. That visibility matters for moral framing. It allows the story to say, this is what came of our choices. Even if the meteorology is indifferent, human beings can't help reading intention into waves that erase palaces and shacks with the same force. Water becomes the arm of justice, not just a physical process. So flood stories persist because they work on multiple channels at once. They encode memories of real disasters in landscapes, where water sometimes behaves in ways that feel apocalyptic. They dramatize the idea that life's most precious gifts, rain, rivers, seas, are not under our control and can turn deadly if disrespected. They provide an image for moral reset that is both terrifying and strangely hopeful. Yes, everything familiar can be swept away, but something clean can be built from what's left. In the Hopi telling, the ending of the Third World is not just about too much water in the wrong places. It's about a civilization that has overstepped so far that only a complete immersion will interrupt its trajectory. That's why it's useful to think of the flood not as a single explanation, but as a layered ending. On one layer, there may well be memories of climate swings, megafloods, river avulsions, and storm cycles that periodically rearranged human settlement patterns. On another layer, there's the ethical narrative. When imbalance becomes extreme, the world resets in a way that feels like drowning. And sitting between those layers is the message that runs through Hopi tradition. The element that ends a world is also the element that makes the next one possible. Water destroys the Third World's excess, and at the same time it prepares the ground, literally and spiritually, for those who will cross over into a new beginning. In Hopi accounts of that Third World flood, the most haunting detail isn't actually the water. It's the thing that lets a few people pass through it. In some public tellings, that thing is described in very simple terms: a reed, a hollow plant, a kind of natural vessel. People climb into it, or cling to it, or follow it, and somehow, while everything else drowns, that fragile living tube carries them from one condition of the world to another. Other versions talk more generally about a boat-like container, a log, a sealed shelter, or an opening that leads into an underground passage. Sometimes Spider-Woman, or another helper figure, is the one who gives the instructions. Gather reed, prepare, go here, not there, wait for the signal. The details shift, but the pattern holds. There is a disaster that no one can stop. There is a small group that has maintained some kind of listening relationship with the sacred order of things. There is a specific, almost humble object or passageway that becomes the means of survival, and there is a crossing out of the familiar through chaos into somewhere else. It's easy to focus on the hardware, the reed, the log, the boat, and imagine early people just trying to explain why someone happened to be in the right canoe at the right time. But in the internal logic of Hopi teaching, that little vessel means much more than lucky raft. It's an answer to the question, how do you move from an old pattern of life that's collapsing into something new without being destroyed? Crossing, in this sense, is doing a lot of work at once. On one level, it's straightforward migration. Flooded lowlands force people onto mesas and high ridges. Rivers that used to be lifelines become obstacles. Clans that once farmed in one place are pushed to learn new landscapes. The reed or boat can be heard as a memory of literal watercraft, or of following reeds and rushes that mark safer channels in flood-changed terrain. On another level, crossing is initiation. You go into the reed, into darkness, into confinement, into uncertainty, and you come out somewhere else, changed. That echoes rites found all over the world. The candidate is symbolically enclosed, separated from ordinary life, taught new knowledge, and then emerges with a new identity. In that reading, the flood isn't just bad weather. It's a planetary initiation ceremony, and the reed is the initiation lodge. And at the deepest level, crossing is transformation of consciousness. You do not bring the third world's mindset into the fourth and expect it to work. The reed is narrow. It doesn't have room for your palaces, your fortifications, your elaborate hierarchies. You pass through with almost nothing except what you've actually learned. Seen this way, the survival vessel is really a filter. Only what can fit through it, ethically, psychologically, spiritually, gets to continue. When you step back, this begins to rhyme with other Ark stories without turning the Hopi narrative into a mere echo of them. In Mesopotamia, Utnapishtim builds a boat, according to divine measurements, loads it with the seed of all living things, and survives a world flood that wipes out a noisy, out-of-control humanity. In the Hebrew Bible, Noah's Ark preserves a remnant of life and a set of instructions for a different kind of covenant after the waters recede. In Indian tradition, Manu is warned by a fish, often identified with a form of the god Vishnu, to build a boat. He ties it to the fish, which guides him through the deluge to a mountain where a new cycle can begin. Across indigenous traditions in the Americas and the Pacific, there are stories of people sheltering in canoes, in hollowed logs, in shells, in caves, in the bellies of giant animals. The details are wildly diverse, but certain motifs keep coming back. Forewarning, preparation, a container, a guide, a crossing, a new beginning. It's tempting to line all this up and say, they all come from the same original myth, or to claim that one culture must have borrowed from another. But the more cautious, and frankly more interesting approach, is to notice convergent solutions to the same existential problem. If you're a human being watching your environment flip from stable to lethal, firestorms, ice sheets, megafloods, dust storms that turn day into night, you are going to ask, is there some small portable way to carry what matters into whatever comes next? The answer that appears again and again is yes, but it requires three things: preparedness, guidance, and humility. Preparedness in these stories is not just stockpiling food. It's long-term attentiveness. In Hopi tradition, the people who survive are usually not the biggest, richest, or loudest. They're the ones who kept listening. They noticed subtle shifts in rain, in plant growth, in animal behavior. They maintained ceremonies even when they seemed unnecessary. They respected warnings that sounded irrational to those invested in business as usual. Guidance is the second ingredient. Someone or something points toward the reed. Maybe it's Spider-Woman, maybe it's a messenger kachina, maybe it's an elder repeating an old instruction about where to go when the waters rise. In other flood traditions, it's a god, a talking animal, a prophetic dream. However you frame it, survival is not a solo improvisation at the last minute. It's a response to directions that were offered long before the crisis hit. And then there's humility. The vessel is small, the crossing is uncomfortable. You do not get to steer the whole way. Utnapishtim seals himself inside his boat and waits. Noah rides out the storm without knowing where he'll make landfall. Manu ties his boat to a fish and lets himself be towed. Hopi survivors in the reed are carried where the current or the helpers take them. Humility here doesn't mean passivity. It means accepting that you are not in charge of the big forces. Climate cycles, tectonics, the deep feedback loops of Earth systems, or, in Hopi language, the balance of the world. Your role is to prepare, to listen, to act promptly when the window for action opens, and then to endure the passage. All of this points toward a very specific lesson embedded in the reed boat arc pattern. Worlds do not just end, they also narrow. As a society pushes imbalance to an extreme, its options quietly shrink. Certain ways of life close off. Certain luxuries stop being possible. At some point, the only way through is a tight channel, a reed, a boat, a moral discipline, where you can't take your previous excess with you. Who actually makes it through that channel depends less on who had the most in the old world, and more on who cultivated the capacity to be guided in the in-between. From a Hopi perspective, that's exactly the position humanity finds itself in after the Third World Flood. The water has done its work, the great structures of the previous age are gone. A few groups, carried by their small vessels of preparedness and humility, find themselves on high ground, or emerging from a passage, looking out at a landscape that is both familiar and utterly new. The crossing is over. The question now is not how did we survive, but how are we going to live here so we don't repeat the same pattern? Because in Hopi teaching, entering a new world is never automatic salvation. It's an invitation to follow new rules, or maybe to finally live up to old ones that were ignored. And that's where the story of the Fourth World begins. In Hopi narratives, the Fourth World is where we are right now, not in some abstract mythic elsewhere, but here, this earth, this sky, this era of highways and satellites and scrolling and wars and elections and shifting climates. The story doesn't end with people climbing out of the reed and saying, "We made it." That's the prologue. The main plot of the Fourth World is about what you do after you've survived. And the key move is subtle but huge. The task changes. In the first, second and third worlds, the drama is mostly about physical survival in the face of forces that feel overwhelming. Fire, ice, flood, chaos. Yes, there are ethical and spiritual teachings attached, but the headlines are about staying alive at all under harsh conditions. In the fourth, the emphasis flips. The danger now is not that the universe is trying to kill you at every moment. It's that you're comfortable enough to forget how fragile balance is, and powerful enough to throw that balance off. So instead of saying, "This world is a test of whether you can build boats fast enough," Hopi teachings about the present age pose a different question. Can you live in a way that keeps things from needing another flood? That's where the idea of stewardship comes in. In public Hopi explanations, the Fourth World is often called a place of opportunity and responsibility. The land is good. There is time to plant, to build, to raise children, to hold ceremonies. But all of that is contingent. Human beings are not owners in the ultimate sense. They are caretakers. The phrase caretakers of the land can sound like a modern environmental slogan, but within Hopi life it points to an integrated practice. Stewardship of land means more than knowing how to grow corn on dry mesas. It's knowing when not to plant because the signs aren't right. It's leaving some spaces alone. It's understanding that springs, hills, and even specific rocks are bound up with stories and obligations. Fields are not just economic units, they are relationships that require offerings, songs, and restraint. Stewardship of community means living inside a web of reciprocity that feels very different from individualism. Clans hold distinct responsibilities. There are people whose job it is to remember particular migrations, to lead particular ceremonies, to mediate disputes, to watch the sky, to teach the children the meanings of the altars and masks and stories. Social status is tied less to accumulation and more to fulfilling these roles properly. When someone fails at their role, not just practically, but in attitude, it's understood as a breach in the world's balance, not just a personal quirk. And then there is stewardship of discipline, the inward part. Hopi teachings for the Fourth World don't just say, "Don't build weapons" or "Don't overuse the land." They also talk about inner states, arrogance, forgetfulness, greed, lack of respect. The discipline required is daily and unglamorous, getting up early for prayers, maintaining ritual cycles even when no one is watching, keeping your word, listening to elders who have no legal power over you, but carry a different authority. From this perspective, the end of a world is not primarily a meteor, a rogue planet, or a divine temper tantrum. It's the outer consequence of a long inner drift. That's where the idea of partial endings is crucial. In Hopi stories, when a world ends, the planet itself does not vanish. The sun doesn't wink out, gravity doesn't stop. Instead, what collapses is a pattern of life, a particular way humans are relating to each other, to non-human beings, and to the sacred order they recognize. The fire that ends the first world doesn't annihilate Earth. It burns out a certain kind of civilization. The ice of the second doesn't shatter the planet. It freezes a way of living that has gone too far in one direction. The flood of the third doesn't erase the continents. It drowns the social and moral structures that refuse to change. You can hear in this a very early, very sophisticated distinction between planetary catastrophe and societal collapse, from a modern angle that maps eerily well onto the difference between, say, an asteroid impact that sterilizes the biosphere and a climate crisis that doesn't kill every organism but does grind down complex societies that refuse to adapt. In Hopi thought, worlds can end for one group and not another. An arrogant city can go under while a small listening community survives on high ground. A whole cultural pattern can die while the mountains quietly continue being mountains. World here means the total design of human life inside the larger creation, and that can break without the creator having to scrap the planet and start over. That nuance matters, especially when people try to mine Hopi narratives for doomsday predictions. In the 20th century, bits and pieces of Hopi prophecy were pulled out of their context and turned into slogans. The world will end if, or the purification day is coming, when often these retellings skip the part about worlds ending in stages, for some people sooner than others, and about the possibility of turning aside from the worst outcomes through restored balance. The internal logic is less. There is a fixed date when everything will explode, and more. There is a threshold past which your own pattern will collapse. Don't cross it. So when Hopi elders talk about the fourth world being out of balance, too much mining, too much drilling, too much disrespect for sacred places, too much obsession with speed and novelty, they are not necessarily saying the earth will be destroyed. They are saying your way of life is soaring through the branch it sits on. We've seen that movie before. Which brings us straight to the modern question the story keeps pressing. What exactly is it warning against now? Is it technology itself? Most Hopi accounts don't frame it that way. After all, previous worlds had their own technologies, ways of organizing labor, building structures, manipulating resources. The problem wasn't tools, it was forgetting the limits around their use. The warning seems to cut in a different direction, against living as if you were disconnected from the consequences of your actions. Living as if water will always be there, no matter how you treat it. As if soil can be endlessly extracted from. As if other people's lands, cultures and ceremonial sites are just resources for your projects. As if economic systems are more real than rain cycles. As if sacred obligations are negotiable when they interfere with profit. From within the story, those are exactly the attitudes that mark the late stage of a world, the phase where the reed is being woven again, whether people notice it or not. And if the fourth world is defined by responsibility rather than mere survival, then the ethical bar is higher. Not destroying the planet is the floor, not the ceiling. The real work is to inhabit a way of life where the need for another purge never ripens. This is where Hopi migration narratives start to make sense as more than folklore. After the emergence into the fourth world, the story shifts into a long period of movement. Clans receive instructions to travel in particular directions, to leave footprints and symbols in specific places, to learn from each landscape and then move on. They don't just wander for fun, they are mapping an ethic onto the land, testing what balanced living actually looks like in different environments. From a distance, those migration stories look like origin tales, show this village got founded, how that spring became sacred. But if you listen in the frame we've just set up, there are also case studies. What happens when people take the Fourth World assignment seriously? How do they treat rivers, mesas, animals, neighbouring groups? What goes wrong when they don't? Where do they choose to settle permanently, and why? What signs tell them it's time to move? In the next part of this story, those migrations stop being abstract and turn into trails you can still walk, petroglyphs you can still see carved into rock, plazas where ceremonies are still held, ruins that may record not just architectural choices but moral experiments. And under all of that runs the same quiet challenge. After 3 lost worlds, what kind of footprint are you willing to leave in the fourth? If you zoom in on that long era of movement after Emergence, something interesting happens. The story stops being about nameless people and starts being about particular clans with particular jobs. Corn Clan, Bear Clan, Snake Clan, Water Clan, Fire Clan, and many more depending on the version you hear. Each one is given a direction to travel, a set of teachings to carry, and, crucially, instructions about how to mark their passing. They are told to leave signs. Sometimes those signs are described as clan symbols carved into rock. Sometimes as altars established in certain places. Sometimes as remembered encounters with other peoples, who are folded into the story as relatives met along the road. In all cases, the migrations do 2 things at once. They tell people who they are, and they tell them how they're supposed to behave. For a Hopi person, a migration story is not just our ancestors came from over there. It's a charter. Because we came this way, because we stopped on that mountain, because we met those relatives. This is what we owe. This is what we know. This is what we must continue. Identity is braided with itinerary. And the route isn't just a line on a map. It's a syllabus. Each landscape teaches something different. A clan might be instructed to travel until they reach a big water, or a snow-capped mountain or a canyon, and then to live there until you have learned all that place has to teach you. Only after that are they supposed to move on, leaving a footprint or symbol as a kind of spiritual receipt. We came, we listened, we're accountable to what we learned here. So what does that look like on the ground? If you step out of the story frame for a minute and into the language of archaeology, the greater Southwest, Arizona, New Mexico, southern Utah and Colorado, northern Mexico, is one of the most intensely mobile cultural landscapes in North America. Over the last 2,000 years especially, we see waves of movement, reorganization and exchange. Archaeologists talk about ancestral Puebloan communities on the Colorado Plateau, Mogollon regions to the south, Hohokam irrigation societies along the desert rivers, and a dense mesh of trade that moves obsidian, shells, turquoise, macaw feathers, cotton textiles, and ritual ideas across hundreds of miles. Sites are occupied for a few generations, expanded into large villages or regional centres, then sometimes thinned out or abandoned, with people relocating to new mesas, new canyons, new river corridors. From a purely academic perspective, that pattern raises all kinds of questions. Were they moving because of droughts, soil exhaustion, trade opportunities, political conflict? Religious reform? Probably some combination varying by time and place. From a Hopi perspective, there's a parallel story running. Clans are on assignments, they are circling, crisscrossing, radiating out from and later returning toward the Hopi mesas, working out in practice what it means to live rightly in the fourth world. The key is not to smash these 2 views together, and pretend they match perfectly. They operate on different levels. Archaeology looks for dates, pottery styles, building patterns. Sacred narratives look for meaning, obligation, continuity. One tracks where people probably were, the other explains why and what it mattered. That's where the idea of leaving signs becomes so important. Across the southwest, you can find petroglyph panels, spirals, animals, human figures, geometric forms, and distinctive clan-like symbols carved into rock faces. You can find shrines, small stone structures on mesa edges, springs marked with offerings, alignments with sunrise and solstice points. Hopi people today sometimes identify particular symbols out there in the landscape as footprints of their own clan's migrations. Those markings in that reading are not random doodles, they're signatures, testifying that a particular group fulfilled its instruction in that place, learned what needed learning, and moved on. But the lesson isn't always triumphant. Some migration stories talk about places where things went wrong, where people forgot their instructions, hoarded water, fought with neighbours, overused resources, or let ceremonies lapse. Those spots can become warnings rather than destinations. We were there. We failed. Don't repeat that pattern. The land becomes a memory palace, not just of roots, but of experiments in how to live. This is what makes sacred geography very different from an academic map. On a standard map, you get rivers, roads, elevation lines, political boundaries. Each point is, in principle, equivalent to any other point, a coordinate, a datum. On a Hopi sacred map, places are not interchangeable. Each spring, mesa, canyon and ruin is woven into a web of stories, songs and duties. A particular butte might be where a clan turned back from going too far. A certain canyon might be the site of a crucial reconciliation between groups. A ruin might not be just abandoned architecture, but the physical trace of a community that completed its migration role and then deliberately dissolved or moved, taking the teachings with them. You can walk through the same landscape with both maps in your head. The archaeologist might say, this region saw a population influx around the 1100s, then a decline and movement toward the Rio Grande in the 1300s. The Hopi elder might say, our clans went there, fulfilled their instructions, left their signs, and later returned to the centre when the time was right. Those aren't mutually exclusive. They're layered descriptions of the same reality, tuned to different kinds of questions. And under both of them sits that deeper pattern we've been tracing since the first world. The journey itself is part of the teaching. The migrations are not just prequels to the real story of settled villages on the mesas. They are the crucible where responsibilities are discovered, where the balance of taking and giving is tested, where the consequences of arrogance or forgetfulness are learned in very concrete ways, sometimes through hunger, sometimes through conflict, sometimes through the relief of rain after a long obedience. If the fourth world is defined by stewardship instead of mere survival, then moving through the land in this way becomes a long apprenticeship. Every footprint, every symbol carved into stone says, we are still learning how not to trigger another ending, which in a world full of people posting decontextualized Hopi prophecies online raises another question. Who actually has the right to tell these stories, and under what conditions? When most people online hear the word Hopi, they don't think of clans leaving careful signs on the landscape. They think of prophecy, mysterious warnings, end times, timelines. Viral posts that begin with the Hopi say and end with a dramatic punchline about 3 days of darkness or blue stars falling or specific dates when the world is supposed to end. There's a problem here. Many of those claims are either distorted, ripped from context, mixed with non-Hopi ideas, or simply made up. And the people who are most cautious about this, who emphasize that certain things are not for public consumption, that certain teachings belong in ceremony or within community are often Hopi themselves. So how did we get from careful place-rooted teachings to clickbait doom-scroll prophecy threads? A big part of the story has to do with who is doing the talking. Much of what English speakers know about Hopi prophecy comes not from Hopi authors, but from outsiders, anthropologists, missionaries, New Age writers, journalists, spiritual entrepreneurs. Each of those groups had their own agendas and blind spots. Early anthropologists were fascinated by anything that looked like a system. They tended to write down what they were told in interview settings, translate it through their own categories, and sometimes merge different storytellers' versions into a single, neat diagram of Hopi cosmology. Missionaries listened for anything that could be framed as proof that the Bible was secretly hidden in Hopi tradition. New Age writers went the other direction. They wanted Hopi prophecy to confirm their own ideas about Atlantis, star people, or the dawning age of Aquarius. Later, environmental activists sometimes quoted what they understood as Hopi warnings about pollution and imbalance to bolster anti-nuclear or climate movements. You can see how the incentive structure worked. If you could present Hopi prophecy as a dramatic countdown, as a last warning before global collapse, your book sold more copies, your documentary got more eyeballs, your social movement had more spiritual backing. Along the way, nuance and Hopi control over how their own knowledge is framed often fell away. That doesn't mean there is no such thing as Hopi prophecy. There are certainly teachings about cycles, about consequences, about what happens when humans abandon their instructions. But we have to distinguish between what is genuinely part of Hopi tradition, as Hopi people describe it, and what has been projected onto it. So if you're watching this and you've seen those viral lists of Hopi prophecies online, how do you approach them? One simple method is a 3-step check: source, context, and voice. First, source. Where is this claim actually coming from? A meme with no citation. A page on a generic native wisdom website that lumps Hopi, Maya, and Lakota sayings together as if they're interchangeable. A self-help book from the 1980s written by a non-native author who cites a Hopi elder with no name and no way to verify. Those are red flags. More promising are sources where you can see a clear line, a named Hopi speaker, an interview whose circumstances are explained, or a Hopi-run publication, cultural office, or community-approved statement. Even there you have to remember, Hopi people are not a monolith. Different villages, clans, and individuals can have different understandings. One person's words are not the official Hopi position on everything. Second, context. Is the prophecy line standing alone, or is it embedded in a larger teaching about behavior, ceremony, and responsibility? Hopi instructions about possible future trouble are usually not just, here is what will happen. They are more like, here is what tends to happen when people live like this. Here is what could happen if you keep ignoring these instructions. Here is what could happen if you realign. Take away that context, and you can turn any warning into a movie trailer. Keep the context, and it looks much more like ethics than prediction. It's advice about how to walk, not a fixed script of how the world must end. Third, voice. Who is centered in the telling? If a piece spends more time describing what non-Hopi seekers should do to save themselves than it does explaining Hopi responsibilities to land, ceremony, and each other, that's a clue. The narrative may have been retooled to make outsiders feel special, chosen, or secretly included in an exclusive set of teachings. By contrast, when Hopi voices are centered, you'll notice recurring themes: obligations to corn, to water, to kivas and altars, to neighbouring peoples, to future generations. The apocalypse in that framing is not a special event on the calendar. It's what happens whenever people systematically break those relationships. In a video like this that raises an obvious ethical question, what can we talk about at all? There are boundaries. Some ceremonies, songs, and details of sacred objects are not meant for public discussion. Some prophecies are understood as clan-specific or restricted, not because they're secret in a sensational way, but because their power depends on being held in the right relationships. There are also materials that have already been made public through published Hopi statements, collaborative projects with scholars, or teachings that some elders decided should be shared more widely as a warning. Those are the things we can responsibly touch on here. Even then, we should treat them as invitations to pay attention, not as collectible spiritual merchandise. So instead of repeating every dramatic line that has been attributed to Hopi prophecy, it may be more honest to step back and ask, when Hopi people describe previous worlds ending through fire, ice, and flood, what kind of behavior are they pointing to? What patterns do they say brought those endings on? Because if you listen carefully across many accounts, the emphasis keeps circling back to the same point. The danger is not that some cosmic switch will flip on a particular date. The danger is that humans who forget their instructions will gradually make the world unlivable. For themselves, for other beings, for the balance that holds everything together. In that sense, the most important forecast isn't about meteors, polar shifts, or blue stars. It's about ethics. Are we in right relation with land and water? Do we remember that power is supposed to serve life, not the other way around? Are ceremonies, however you understand them, still connecting people to humility and gratitude, or have they become empty performances? When Hopi teachers speak about possible endings to this fourth world, they often do so as a mirror, not as a script. If we refuse the mirror, if we reduce their teachings to another piece of doomsday spectacle, we may end up reenacting the very forgetfulness the stories are designed to prevent. If we sit with the mirror, something else becomes possible. We can start to see fire, ice, and flood, not just as special effects in a prophetic movie, but as ways of talking about recurring human patterns, runaway heat, paralyzing coldness, overwhelming consequences that might be showing up in our own age in new forms. And that brings us straight back to the heart of the question. Beyond memes and misquotations, what do those three lost worlds actually say about the way catastrophe unfolds, and about how people might still choose differently? Fire, ice, flood. On the surface, they're just elements. Things that happen out there in the world. Volcanoes erupt. Forests burn. Glaciers advance. Rivers jump their banks and swallow valleys. So one way to hear the Hopi story of three lost worlds is as a memory of real hazards. Maybe even of specific events. Great fires, sudden freezes, devastating floods that left marks on the landscape and on people's minds. But element stories do something subtler too. They turn raw experience into a pattern, a way of thinking about how humans behave when things start to go wrong. Think about fire. In the first world accounts, people are often described as misusing what they've been given. They become careless. They take more than they need. They start harming each other, animals, and the land. The ending is heat, burning, on one level that might echo natural disaster. Wildfires, lava, searing drought. In the southwest, all of that is historically real. Tree ring records show extreme dry periods. Archaeology shows villages abandoned after fires and crop failures. But psychologically, fire is also anger, impulse, runaway intensity. A hot society is one where everything keeps speeding up. Production, warfare, consumption, punishment. Where people burn through resources, patience, and each other. You can feel that parallel. When anger becomes the main fuel, everything looks like kindling. Every insult, every scarcity, every difference becomes another excuse to ignite. Leaders stoke rage because it's easy to mobilize. Industries stoke desire because it's easy to sell. Eventually, the fire doesn't stay contained. It jumps the fire breaks. What started as internal heat spills out into actual physical damage. In that light, the First World doesn't just end in flames. It burns from the inside out long before the visible catastrophe. Ice looks very different, but it may be describing a related pattern from the opposite direction. In Second World stories, people multiply, spread out, become more sophisticated in some ways and more disconnected in others. There is more structure, more complexity, more specialization. The ending is cold, rigidity, a world locking up. Again, there are possible physical echoes here. Paleoclimate data shows repeated cold snaps, abrupt climate reversals that could have hit human communities hard. We know that ice can move fast, geologically speaking. Coasts can freeze, growing seasons can vanish, but psychologically ice is indifference. It's what happens when people stop caring. When the bonds of kinship and reciprocity get replaced by calculation. When rules harden but compassion doesn't keep up. You felt that kind of cold. Bureaucratic cold, social cold, the chill of walking through a city where people learn to step over someone suffering on the sidewalk because they're not my problem. In an icy society, systems keep functioning, sometimes very efficiently, but warmth leaks out. Elders get sidelined, children become units in a plan instead of beings to be listened to. Obligations to land and water are pushed into the fine print. Ice spreads quietly. It doesn't announce itself like a wildfire. It just accumulates layer by layer until ordinary human warmth can't get through. You can read the Second World as a warning about that kind of freeze, the moment when order without heart becomes just as deadly as chaos. Then there's flood. Third World accounts often talk about a peak, great power, impressive constructions, impressive knowledge. People learn to do extraordinary things, and then they use that power carelessly or cruelly. The ending is water, not a gentle rain, but a surge. On the physical side, floods are absolutely part of the deep record. Coastlines have drowned and re-emerged many times. Glacial lakes have burst and carved canyons in days. River systems in the southwest have shifted course dramatically, washing away fields and homes. But on the inside, flood feels like overwhelm. Too much, too fast. Information you can't process. Responsibilities you can't carry. Consequences you can't dodge anymore. A flood society is one that has opened every tap but forgotten how to build channels. Consumption, data, noise, obligations, everything pouring in with no real way to sort or absorb it. At first, that can feel like abundance. Look at all this water. Look at all these options. Look at all this power. Then the banks fail. The levees break. The very capacity that made the society feel invincible becomes the thing that drowns it. So you can line the three up. Fire as rage and appetite out of control. Ice as numbness and rigid systems that no longer serve life. Flood as overwhelm when accumulated choices finally rush back all at once. None of that cancels the possibility that people also remembered literal fires, literal freezes, literal deluges. It's more that the stories seem to operate on both channels at once. That may be one reason they endure. A story that is only about one volcanic eruption or one river flood belongs mostly to that generation. Once the event fades from living memory, the tale dries up. But a story that can speak to external hazard and inner habit at the same time is portable. As technology changes, as economies and empires rise and fall, you can keep applying the pattern. A village farmer can hear fire and think of a hillside burning. A modern listener can hear fire and think of weapons, markets or tempers spiraling out of control. Same symbol. New era. The story stays alive by shifting what it points to. And notice how all three elements connect back to social balance. Hot anger spreads faster in a society already out of alignment, where some take too much and others are cornered into desperation. Cold indifference only becomes dominant when people let go of obligations that used to tie them to each other and to place. Overwhelming floods, in both the literal and metaphorical sense, usually hit hardest where safeguards have been neglected or dismantled. From that angle, the cause of catastrophe isn't just the element. It's the way a community has set up its relationships long before the fire catches, before the ice forms, before the waters rise, which leads to a different way of hearing the word ending, not as a single cinematic day when the sky cracks and everything stops, more like a long process. A drift, a series of small decisions that heat things up, cool them down, or pile them higher until a threshold is crossed and the change becomes visible. By the time the flames are on the horizon, or the lakes are freezing solid, or the water is at your door, most of the ending has already happened. The Hopi worlds, told this way, aren't just three disasters separated by clean breaks. They're three long experiments in how humans handle power, comfort, and connection, and three demonstrations of what tends to happen when we push too far in one direction and don't correct. Which then raises the unsettling mirror for us in this so-called fourth world. If fire is anger and runaway heat, if ice is indifference, if flood is overwhelm, what are we doing with those forces right now? And if an ending is a process rather than a date, how far along that process might we already be without quite admitting it to ourselves? Science comes at these questions from a very different angle. Instead of stories passed person to person, it works with rocks, ice, mud, tree rings, pollen, bones, abandoned rooms. You take a lake, drill down through the mud at the bottom. Each layer is a time capsule, grains of pollen, ash from distant fires, tiny shells that only grow in certain temperatures or salinities. You date the layers with radiocarbon, with the decay of radioactive elements, with volcanic ash whose age is known from elsewhere. You take ice from Greenland or Antarctica. Every year, snowfall traps a thin film of air. Stack enough years, and you get an ice core that's effectively a frozen archive of the atmosphere. Tiny bubbles reveal past carbon dioxide levels. Ratios of oxygen isotopes trace temperature. Layers of dust and sulfate mark big eruptions, burning continents, desert storms. You take trees, especially old ones in places like the American Southwest. Their growth rings narrow in drought, widen when water is plentiful. Match patterns from living trees to dead wood, and you can build multi-thousand-year timelines of wet and dry cycles, decade-long megadroughts you'd never guess from modern weather. You take stalagmites in caves. Their slow drip-drip growth locks in signals of rainfall and groundwater over tens of thousands of years. You take charcoal in sediment to track how often landscapes burned. You take animal bones and seeds from old trash heaps to see what people were eating, when the menu suddenly changed, when it suddenly stopped. Put all that together, and a picture of past climate and catastrophe starts to emerge. We can say with pretty high confidence that the planet has swung between warmer and colder states many times. That sea levels have risen more than 100 meters, drowning ancient coasts, and then fallen again to expose new land. That there were intervals when volcanic activity spiked, when meteorites hit, when ocean circulation flipped, when rainfall belts shifted hundreds of miles. We can also say that in the Southwest specifically, climate has been anything but stable. Tree rings show multi-year and multi-tidecade droughts that make the Dust Bowl look like a dry summer. Archaeology around places like Chaco Canyon and Mesa Verde shows sophisticated communities flourishing, then downsizing, then scattering just as those prolonged dry spells hit. Irrigation systems silt up. Fields are abandoned. Defensive sites on mesas and cliffs suddenly become much more common. From the scientist's perspective, these are stressors. Not single movie-style apocalypses, but ratcheting pressures. Water becomes less predictable, so people dig more canals, build more storage, compete more intensely for the good fields and springs. Forests around pueblos get cut faster for firewood and building. Game animals get hunted harder as crops start to fail. Trade networks expand to buffer the risk, but that also means more points of friction, more chances for conflict. Some lines of evidence, burn layers, fortification walls, trauma on skeletons, suggest that in certain times and places, violence climbed right alongside environmental stress. If you want to, you can look at all this and be tempted to say, here's the fire, here's the ice, here's the flood, to match one specific drought to one specific Hopi story, to pinpoint the event that must be the first world's burning or the third world's drowning. This is where science hits one of its real limits. Correlation is not proof of connection. It's entirely possible for an oral tradition to echo a real climate event or a series of them, and it's also entirely possible for similar patterns to arise in different times and places simply because humans are dealing with similar forces. Science can tell you around this century there was a megadrought. In this river system there was a massive flood. On this coastline, sea levels swallowed the old shore. It can say human groups here seem to have reorganized, migrated, changed diets, changed tools. It can sometimes say there was a population decline or these people moved from here to there. What it can almost never say is this exact Hopi narrative is about that exact event. The resolution is wrong. The dating is fuzzy. Stories drift and condense. Many lived experiences can fold into a single powerful tale. And even if we could line them up perfectly on a timeline, there's another gap science can't bridge by itself. It can chart when rainfall dropped and conflict rose. It can't tell you what it felt like to lose a spring you visited since childhood. It can't tell you what a particular community promised its deities, or what it believed it had broken when the corn stopped growing. It can't tell you why one village chose to fight and another chose to leave. That's where different knowledge systems are doing different jobs. Geology and climatology are excellent at answering what happened and how did the physical system respond. Archaeology and genetics add who was there and how did their numbers and behaviours shift. Hopi narratives are focused on a different layer of reality. What did it mean that this happened? How are we living in relation to the land, to each other, to the sacred? What kinds of choices turn a hard time into an ending or into a passage? Even the word collapse looks different depending on which lens you use. In popular science writing, collapse often sounds like extinction. Lights off, civilization gone. But when researchers actually track what happens on the ground, it's usually more like transformation. Populations shrink, disperse, regroup, monumental architecture stops. Smaller, more flexible settlements appear. Old trade hubs empty. But new ones pop up downriver or up on the mesa tops. From a distance, Chaco falls. From close-up, you see families reweaving themselves into different patterns, different towns, different alliances, sometimes different ritual systems. People don't vanish. They change how and where they live. That's not so different from the Hopi idea of moving through worlds. Each world ends in one form, but a remnant carries forward. They pass through a sipapu or rise in a reed boat, and the next phase begins with a mixture of old memory and new responsibility. The catastrophe is real, but so is continuity. So instead of asking science to prove or disprove the stories, it may be more useful to let them sit side by side. The measurements tell us that fire, ice, and flood, in the literal sense, really have reshaped human possibilities over and over. The stories tell us how those forces are experienced from the inside, and what kinds of conduct people came to see as dangerous long before the final spark or the last wave. Different tools, different questions. Sometimes they overlap. Sometimes they simply run parallel. And together they set us up for the unsettling part, looking at our own fourth world moment with both lenses at once, seeing what the instruments say is coming, and what the old patterns say about how we tend to handle power when the pressure starts to rise. If you strip the Hopi cycles down to their bones, a pattern keeps surfacing. Each world doesn't end just because something out there changes. Not just because the sun burns hotter, the winds turn colder, or the waters rise higher. It ends because of how people are living when those changes arrive. In the first world, the problem is often described as fundamental imbalance, violence, cruelty, forgetting the instructions. In the second and third, it's expansion without restraint, cleverness outrunning wisdom, power used without regard for consequence. If you listen with that in mind, it's hard not to hear an echo in the present. We are, by any measure, living in a peak power moment. Technologically, economically, informationally, we can move more earth, burn more fuel, cut more forest, haul more fish, extract more attention in a single year than many earlier societies could in a century. And like those earlier worlds, we're not doing it in a vacuum. The instruments are giving us their own version of warning stories. Rising CO2, record heat, mass extinction curves, groundwater dropping, glaciers thinning. Social measures too, widening inequality, political polarization, epidemics of loneliness, fraying trust. The details are new. The underlying themes, overreach, disconnection, forgetting limits, sound very old. Hopi teachings, like many indigenous traditions, keep circling back to relationship. Right relationship with the land, with other beings, with the sacred, with one another. The opposite of that is not one big dramatic sin, it's the slow normalization of imbalance. In modern terms, that looks like treating the atmosphere as a waste dump, because no single smokestack seems to matter. Treating oceans as infinite because each plastic bottle feels trivial. Treating other people as avatars on a screen instead of neighbours whose well-being is tied to ours. Division is part of this too. In the stories of the earlier worlds, people start to forget they are one people. Clans fight. Those with more power or stronger magic exploit. Those with less. The instructions that were supposed to keep everyone aligned get twisted into tools of control or simply ignored. Today, we're not living in small villages feuding over springs. We're in a hyper-connected algorithm, steered information ecology where outrage pays better than nuance, where it's easy to divide humans into my side and their side, and to forget that biologically and historically, we're all descendants of the same handful of survivors who made it through past bottlenecks. Overconsumption, division, disconnection from place and from each other. These are not just ethical concerns. In the Hopi frame, they are early-stage symptoms of a world moving toward its breaking point. The fire, ice or flood, whether literal or metaphorical, are the late-stage consequences. Does that mean we are destined for a fourth world catastrophe, upgraded with smartphones and satellite data? That's where it's important not to slide into easy prophecy. Hopi knowledge holders are generally very cautious about making specific predictions, especially for outside audiences. And the scientific picture, as we saw, is one of probabilities and scenarios, not fate carved in stone. A more careful way to put it is this: if endings begin in behaviour, then our timeline is not fixed. The when and the how bad depend on what we collectively choose to normalise, to resist, to change. And here's where another part of the Hopi cycle becomes relevant: not the disasters, but the survivals. Every world in these stories has a remnant that makes it through. Not because they had better bunkers or bigger walls, but because they had maintained or rediscovered a way of living that was more in balance. They listened. They paid attention to instruction. They stayed in relationship with something larger than themselves. Translated into contemporary language, you could call that resilience. Not resilience as in toughing it out alone, but as in systems that bend without breaking. Communities that can absorb shock because there are real ties between people, because knowledge is shared, because decisions are made with humility rather than short-term extraction. Community ties show up in data as one of the strongest predictors of how well people weather disasters, from hurricanes to heat waves. Humility shows up in whether leaders listen to feedback, change course when evidence shifts, acknowledge limits instead of pretending they don't exist. Listening shows up in whose voices are taken seriously. Scientists, elders, marginalized communities on the front lines of change, or only those already in power. In that sense, the antidotes to fourth world imbalance are not mysterious. They are unglamorous, often small-scale practices, knowing your neighbours, supporting local food systems, learning the history of the land you're on, participating in decisions that shape your town, your workplace, your online spaces. From a Hopi-informed perspective, balance isn't just a global policy goal measured in gigatons of carbon. It's also personal and relational. How do you treat water in your daily life as a living gift or as a background utility? How do you engage in disagreement as a chance to sharpen understanding or as a battle to be won? How much of your attention is spent in places that leave you more grounded and how much in spaces that leave you more agitated and divided? None of these by themselves will save the world, but that may be the wrong scale to start with. Worlds in the Hopi stories don't just flip from good to doomed overnight. They drift. They accumulate a pattern of choices. The accumulated pattern is what finally meets the drought, the fire, the rising water. If that's so, then the relevant question for our fourth world moment isn't what year will it all collapse, but what pattern are we laying down right now? Because if endings begin in behaviour, then so do different endings. A world can end in fire, or in a managed retreat, in chaotic flood, or in a hard but conscious reshaping of how we live. It can end as an extinction, or as a passage into a new arrangement that carries more of us, and more of what we care about, through the Sipapu. We don't get to choose the forces, plate tectonics, solar output, orbital cycles, basic physics. We do get some say in how prepared, how connected, how balanced we are when those forces move. And that, in a very real sense, is what fourth world responsibility looks like. Not waiting for prophecy to be fulfilled one way or another, but living as if the stories are mirrors, showing us what has gone wrong before and hinting at how much room we still have to steer before the next threshold is crossed. We've been talking about stories that warn without claiming certainty, stories that try to tune our attention instead of just scaring us. That's actually the spirit behind something I've been working on outside this channel, and I want to mention it briefly. Then we'll come right back to the Hopi worlds. If you're interested in mysteries like this, ancient climate crashes, vanished cultures, strange archaeological finds, but you also want to keep one foot firmly in evidence and not fall down every internet rabbit hole, I've put together a book that might be up your alley. It looks at 12 unexplained or partially explained mysteries from deep time to recent history. Things like sudden collapses, odd engineering feats, anomalous remains. For each one we walk through what's actually known, what's speculation, and where the data just runs out. No, and therefore aliens. No, and therefore the ancients had quantum computers. Just that space we almost never pause in. Here's what we can say, here's what we can't yet say, and here's why it still matters. If that sounds like something you'd want on your shelf, You can grab it through the website. There's a link in the description, and there's a discount running this week. If you're watching this later, the link will still work. You just might not get the reduced price. Okay, back to World's Ending. Because the reason I'm mentioning that book in the middle of a Hopi episode isn't just promotion. It's because the same question runs underneath both. What do we do with mystery? Faced with an origin story where 3 entire worlds rise and fall before ours, we have options. We can flatten it into literalism. So, 3 global civilizational resets definitely happened exactly like this on these dates with this technology. We can flatten it into dismissal. It's just myth. Interesting as folklore, useless for understanding reality. Or we can sit in the more uncomfortable space between those. We can ask, why has this particular pattern of fire, ice and flood, of imbalance and correction, held the attention of an actual living people for so long? Why is it still told, still guarded, still argued over? Hopi world cycle stories are not Marvel movies. They aren't designed as entertainment. They're part of a living ethical system, a way of aligning behavior with a sense of cosmic order. When an elder talks about a previous world destroyed by fire, or by freezing, or by rising waters, they're not just giving you disaster porn. They're talking about how human beings slowly wandered out of right relationship, and what it felt like when the larger systems they depended on stopped being forgiving. If you approach that with a purely sensational mindset, could this be proof of a lost high-tech civilization? Did the Hopi secretly predict our exact climate scenario to the year? You risk missing the point. At the same time, if you treat it as nothing but metaphor, you risk missing something else. The possibility that these stories carry dimly remembered experiences of real droughts, real cold snaps, real floods, filtered through generations of retelling. The trick is to let the story keep its thickness. Part of that thickness is respect. Hopi teachings aren't public domain puzzle pieces for outsiders to rearrange however we like. There are layers that are shared openly, layers that are contextual, and layers that simply aren't ours to handle. Even the versions that have made their way into English through books and anthropology notes are often partial or coloured by the agendas of the people who recorded them. So a responsible approach does 2 things at once. It listens for the human universals, the themes of overreach, forgetting limits, using power carelessly, and takes those seriously as guidance. And it keeps a humble distance from definitive claims about what really happened, about what the Hopi must have known about orbital cycles or plate tectonics, about exactly how their prophecies map onto our news cycle. That humility, ironically, lets the story have more power, not less. Because when you stop trying to squeeze a narrative into proved or debunked, you can start asking deeper questions like, why does flood appear in so many traditions as both punishment and cleansing? Why does fire show up as both destruction and illumination? Why is the cold not just an environmental event, but a moral one? People freezing in their hearts toward one another before the world itself freezes. Those symbolic patterns don't cancel out literal events, they often sit on top of them. A society really can burn its forests, its soils, its social fabric until the landscape around it is more flammable in every sense. A real drought can then tip a stressed system into collapse. Later tellings remember both, the heat of the sun and the heat of human greed. A real period of ice and scarcity can push people into withdrawal, hoarding, closing boundaries. Later, that withdrawal is remembered as a moral chill. A real flood can follow years of poor land management, deforestation, building too close to rivers. The water is literal, but so is the cleansing of old arrangements that were already unsustainable. In the last part of this episode, we're going to walk that line as carefully as we can. We'll look at what might plausibly sit underneath the three Hopi world endings: fire, ice, and flood. If you line them up next to what geologists and climate scientists have pieced together about the deep past, we'll also stay with what they mean symbolically, as patterns of behaviour, as psychological states, as warnings about how worlds, including ours, drift toward their thresholds. Not to solve the myth once and for all, or to turn Hopi teachings into a neat chart of collapses, but to see how a story can hold both a memory of what may have happened and a mirror for what's happening now. So let's turn to the core question people keep asking, sometimes a little too eagerly: what, if anything, actually ended those three lost worlds? If you strip the Hopi cycle down to its simplest outline, the three previous worlds end the same way over and over again, just with different costumes. First, a world that burns. Things get too hot, too intense, too accelerated. Fire on the land, fire in people's behaviour. Second, a world that freezes. Not just cold weather, but a kind of hardening and separation. Connections snap. Life pulls back into tiny islands of survivability. Third, a world that drowns. Structures that look solid get swallowed. Boundaries blur. What used to be firm ground turns out to be temporary. Fire, ice, flood, heat, cold water. You can hear these as three different disaster movies, three distinct apocalypses. But within the tradition, they're not really disconnected. They're variations on one theme: what happens when a world goes out of balance and refuses to correct itself. One way to make sense of this is to imagine three layers stacked on top of each other. The first layer is the one we're most comfortable with in the modern world: natural hazard. On this layer, fire can point toward volcanic eruptions, wildfires, droughts, heat waves, maybe even impacts or bursts of solar activity. Hopi territory sits in a landscape shaped by ancient lava flows, cinder cones, burn scars, and long punishing dry spells. It wouldn't be surprising if memories of intense heat and flame, whether from the sky or from human-made burning, stuck in the collective imagination. Ice could echo episodes of unusual cold failed harvests, late frosts, winters that seemed not to end. The southwest has records in tree rings of multi-year cold snaps, and if you widen the view to the northern hemisphere, you hit the tail end of the Ice Age, abrupt climate swings, and the Younger Dryas cold period. You don't need a full return of continental glaciers to produce stories of a world that becomes unlivable for those who don't adjust. Flood is the easiest to map onto physical events. The Colorado Plateau and its neighbours are full of ancient lake beds, floodplains, and the scars of catastrophic outburst floods. Even on more recent human timescales, intense monsoon years, snowmelt surges, or the failure of natural dams can leave whole valleys erased. If your people live in that kind of terrain long enough, you will tell stories about waters that come higher than they're supposed to. That's the natural hazard layer. It matters. It anchors the story to a real, risky planet. But by itself, it doesn't explain why entire worlds are described as ending. That's where the second layer comes in: social breakdown. In Hopi versions that have been shared publicly, the end of a world doesn't happen just because the sun gets hotter or the snow gets deeper. It happens because, as those pressures build, people stop listening to each other, to the guidance they've been given, to the signs of the land itself. In the first world, as it's often told, beings become arrogant, self-absorbed. They use their gifts for selfish ends. Fire, in that context, isn't just physical heat, it's uncontrolled energy. Population growth without restraint, resource use without reciprocity, technology without wisdom. Once the social brakes are gone, any environmental stressor can push the system into runaway mode. In the second world, expansion and cleverness outpace solidarity. People scatter, build, compare, compete. When things turn cold, literally or figuratively, there's no dense web of obligation and care to cushion the shock. Small groups turn inward. Hoarding makes sense in the short term and disastrous in the long term. Ice becomes a metaphor for isolation, but it also describes what happens to a network when the ties between its nodes freeze and snap. In the third world, power concentrates. Some climb towers, others are left below. Communication breaks down not because it's impossible, but because it's inconvenient to those in charge. In that setting, floods aren't just high water. They're what happens when all the local buffers have been stripped away. Forests cut, terraces neglected, rituals of reciprocity abandoned. The system loses its ability to absorb even predictable pulses of water. One big storm, one bad year, and everything that looks stable dissolves. So the pattern isn't random act of God, everyone equally surprised. Its warning signs emerge, small corrections are possible, those corrections are ignored, stresses accumulate. Then, when the environmental blow finally lands, the society shatters instead of flexing. That leads to the third layer, the one Hopi storytellers lean on most heavily, moral teaching. On this layer, the details of whether the first ending was a megadrought in year X, or a series of smaller heat waves over centuries, stop being the main point. The main point becomes, each world reached a threshold not because bad weather existed, but because people chose repeatedly to drift away from balance. From this angle, trying to match each world ending 1-to-1 with a single scientific event almost misses the structure of the story. It's like insisting that a parable about a house built on sand must refer to a specific construction code violation in a specific coastal town. Could there be echoes of actual Ice Age meltwater pulses in the flood world? Maybe could the fire world preserve memory of regional volcanism or meteor airbursts? Possibly could the cold world dimly echo abrupt climate shifts picked up in Greenland ice cores. It's not out of the question. But the Hopi cycle doesn't act like a set of dated news reports. It acts like a compression algorithm, a long, messy series of smaller crises, adaptations, failures and partial recoveries gets folded into a clean narrative. A world, a drift, a refusal to change, an ending, a passage. Seen that way, the what ended them. Question has a surprisingly consistent answer. It wasn't just the fire, or the ice, or the water. It was imbalance, recognized and left uncorrected. It was the moment when people who knew, or could have known, that their way of living was out of right relationship, decided to keep going anyway, trusting inertia over insight. In that light, even the word end becomes slippery. For the Hopi worlds don't just stop. There is always an emergence, an ascent, a movement through some kind of narrow passage, reed, sipapu, boat, underground tunnel, into a new arrangement. The catastrophe clears the board, but it also opens a door. So you can hear the same story two ways. From one angle, it's about annihilation. 3 times humanity pushes things too far, and 3 times the cosmos answers with elemental force. From another angle, it's about forced transition 3 times. The old pattern proves unsustainable, and 3 times a small remnant accepts the pain of leaving it behind and carries a seed of something different into a new world. Which raises a question that sits right at the edge between myth and our own headlines. Are we supposed to be afraid of the fire, the ice, the water? Or are we supposed to be afraid of the point where we can still change course and choose not to? In other words, is the end of a world an external event that happens to us? Or is it what you call the moment when a long series of choices locks in and there's no easy way back? The Hopi cycle doesn't answer that neatly. It leaves it hanging as a tension. Worlds end. Worlds begin, natural forces play their part. So do human beings, And somewhere in between those there is a window where catastrophe and transition are both possible names for the same turning. What we call it may depend on what we do before it arrives. So where does that leave us here, in what Hopi people often call the fourth world? In the stories that have been made public, this isn't the perfect world or the final world or the guaranteed safe world. It's the world of a test. Not a test like a multiple-choice exam that you either pass or fail once. More like an ongoing check-in. Given everything you've inherited, what are you going to do with it? Because remember, in the Hopi cycle, each new world isn't created out of nothing. It's seeded by the survivors of the last one, the people who come through the reed, or climb the ladder, or emerge from the sipapu don't arrive empty-handed. They carry habits, skills, scars, stories, tendencies. If you think back to that genetic bottleneck we talked about earlier in the video, it's a strangely similar logic. A tiny, nearly extinguished human population staggers through 117,000 years of crisis and comes out on the other side, different. Smarter in some ways, tougher in others, more capable of cooperation and communication, but also shaped by trauma, by the constant pressure of scarcity and danger. Then the climate eases, the world opens, and the question isn't, will there ever be another drought or flood or volcanic eruption? The question is, what will these newly forged humans build now that they're not backed into a corner? The Hopi Fourth World frames that same question in moral and spiritual terms. In many versions that have been shared, the beings who emerge into this world are given explicit instructions. Live in balance, respect the boundaries of the land, keep certain ceremonies, remember the covenants that were made with the Creator and the spiritual helpers. Don't forget that worlds have ended before. They're told that this world will offer both abundance and temptation. That there will be a flowering of knowledge, technology and power beyond anything the earlier world saw. And that precisely because of that, the risk of imbalance will be sharper, quieter, more seductive. Instead of obviously monstrous behaviour, constant violence, blatant cruelty, you get things that look normal. Constant acceleration, endless growth, tools that can reach anywhere on the planet, amplify any voice, move resources from any place to any other, without necessarily checking whether the relationships underneath can bear that strain. In the third world, as the story goes, corruption and excess become unmistakable. Towers are built, people are stratified, the land is pushed until it breaks. In the fourth world, imbalance might not look like cartoon villainy. It might look like billions of small, reasonable decisions that add up to a pattern no one intended. If the earlier endings were about obvious disobedience, open rejection of the guidance that had been offered, the fourth world's danger might be amnesia, forgetting that we're in a cycle at all, treating the current way of living as the only way that could ever exist. Within Hopi teaching, the remedy for that isn't a single prophecy date or a checklist of events that will guarantee doom. It's something much harder to package, a daily practice of remembering that you live in a world that can in fact end. And not just end in fire, ice or flood out there, but end in the quiet collapse of meaning. End in the point where you know things are out of balance, individually or collectively, and you stop feeling any obligation to correct it. So what do we do with that, as people watching this video on modern devices, sitting in a civilization whose power depends on burning ancient sunlight, damming rivers, moving ice melt and heat around the globe? One response is fear. The Hopi say the world will end soon headline. The scramble to find a specific prophecy that maps perfectly onto our newsfeed. Another response, the one that seems closer to the heart of the tradition, is responsibility. If worlds have ended before, and if a small remnant has always carried a seed forward, then the real question isn't, are we doomed? It's, what seeds are we preparing in case this pattern runs its course again? That might sound huge and abstract, but it can be painfully concrete. What kinds of relationships are you building that could survive a shock? Economic, ecological, emotional. What kinds of knowledge are you passing on that aren't just about exploiting the world, but about knowing how to live with it? What stories are you telling, in your family, your community, your own head, about what it means to be successful, to be secure, to be advanced? Because if the lesson of the earlier worlds is that imbalance ends badly, the lesson of the fourth seems to be that balance has to be created deliberately. Again and again, even when you have every tool and every temptation not to bother. And that's not just a Hopi idea. You can hear faint echoes of it in climate science, in resilience thinking, in systems theory. Complex systems fail when feedback is suppressed, when warnings are ignored, when buffers are stripped away in the name of efficiency. The fourth world puts a face on that. It says, don't assume you'll be the exception. Don't assume that because you can do something, you'll always be allowed to keep doing it without consequence. At the same time, it doesn't demand despair. Every emergent story in the cycle is also a story about stubborn, almost unreasonable hope, about people walking into the unknown with just enough trust to keep going. So maybe the most practical takeaway, paradoxically, is a kind of curiosity. Instead of asking, is this the end? We can ask, if this were a turning, what would I want to have already started? What skills, what relationships, what ways of seeing would I wish I'd been cultivating? And then, very quietly, start living as if your answer matters. If these kinds of deep time perspectives and origin cycles fascinate you, and you want to go further than we can in a single video, I've put together a book that dives into 12 of the most intriguing prehistoric secrets we've uncovered so far: bottlenecks, migrations, forgotten technologies, and the stories that may have carried them. You can read more about it and pick up a copy on the website. There's a link waiting for you down in the description. While you're there, if this exploration of the Hopi worlds and our own fourth world stirred anything in you, it really helps the channel if you tap like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next. And I'd love to hear from you personally. Drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from in the world and how these ideas land in the place you call home. Do the Hopi stories feel like echoes of your own traditions? Do they clash with them? Do they raise more questions than they answer? That space between familiarity and strangeness, between science and story, between fear of endings and curiosity about what might emerge next, is where this whole series lives. And maybe that's the most fourth world thing we can do. Keep asking, keep listening, keep comparing notes across cultures and disciplines, and refuse to settle too quickly on a single, simple story about how this all turns out. Because worlds have ended before, ours is still in motion. And somewhere between the fire, the ice, and the water, there might be room for a different kind of world to begin, depending in ways we don't entirely understand on what we choose to do now.